Like many ancient peoples whose earliest history remains hidden in silence, the community later known as Urartu only becomes visible once it enters the written record. Their existence can be traced with certainty only from the moment they appear in accounts describing major political and military events. Yet even then, the earliest names by which they were known do not come from their own voice. Instead, information about their origins and early history survives almost entirely through Assyrian records, beginning in the early 1st millennium BCE, which describe the tribes and regions of Uranu and Nairi. The events reflected in these early sources reveal a connection between the political landscape of the 9th century BCE and the later Urartian state. This link is evident in the way certain titles used by the Assyrians later appear among the royal designations of Urartian kings. In their earliest inscriptions, these rulers described themselves as kings of Nairi. At the same time, they referred to their own land by a different name, Biainili. The meaning of this word remains unclear, yet its form strongly suggests that it belongs to the Urartian language itself. By adopting the title King of Nairi, Urartian rulers continued an older Assyrian tradition of geographic naming, rather than asserting an entirely new political identity. The earliest surviving inscription associated with Urartu, written in Assyrian during the reign of Sarduri in the 9th century BCE, records the first known use of this title. The same designation appears again in a bilingual inscription commissioned by his son, Ishpuini. In this case, the contrast is especially revealing. The Assyrian version refers to the ruler as King of Nairi, while the Urartian version identifies him as King of Biainili. This dual naming reflects a political reality shaped by external perception as much as internal identity. About a century later, during the reign of King Rusa, a similar bilingual inscription presents an important shift. In the Urartian text, Biainili remains the name of the land, but the Assyrian version now uses the term Urartu. This change appears to reflect contemporary political circumstances, rather than linguistic evolution. It is important to note that neither Urartu nor Nairi originated in the Urartian language itself. Both terms belong to the political and geographic vocabulary of Assyria. Their use likely served Assyrian imperial narratives and expansionist aims. Modern scholarship continues to employ the term Urartu largely because it is rooted in Assyrian documentation, even though Biainili is increasingly used as an alternative in academic literature. The earliest historical mention of the name Urartu appears in inscriptions of Shalmaneser I in the 13th century BCE. Under this designation, 8 distinct lands were grouped together. A record of his campaign against these regions survives on a stone tablet discovered in Assur. According to this account, during the first year of his reign, the king sent his armies against territories described as having rebelled. He claimed to have conquered multiple lands, destroyed dozens of settlements, seized their wealth, and imposed permanent tribute. Such descriptions, however, must be approached with caution. Assyrian war narratives follow highly stylized literary conventions. They rely on repeated formulas, exaggerated claims, and dramatic imagery designed to glorify royal power. Victories are compressed into impossibly short time frames. Resistance is minimized, and earlier texts are sometimes reused to reinforce ideological messages. When these conventions are taken into account, the campaign described by Shalmaneser I likely represents the first Assyrian encounter with the regions later associated with Urartu. References to rebellion may have served to justify aggressive expansion, rather than describe actual uprisings. Geographic descriptions in these texts emphasize extreme mountain terrain. a motif that appears repeatedly in later Assyrian royal inscriptions. Such imagery strongly suggests a location near Lake Van. This interpretation is supported by later inscriptions from the region, including texts associated with King Rusa that mention settlements close to the sanctuary of the god Haldi. Place names recorded in Assyrian sources from this period continue to appear in later records, indicating a lasting awareness of the region within Assyrian political geography. Over time, Assyrian campaigns pushed steadily northward. These advances likely required the prior subjugation of eastern portions of the former Mitanni sphere. Later, Assyrian kings celebrated these conquests as personal achievements, even though some accounts may draw heavily from earlier royal annals. This blending of historical memory and propaganda complicates efforts to reconstruct events with precision. Beyond Urartu, another key term emerges in Assyrian sources: Nairi. This name appears frequently during the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta I, whose inscriptions devote extensive attention to campaigns against the Nairi lands. These repeated conflicts indicate that the region posed a significant obstacle to Assyrian expansion. After claiming victory, the Assyrian king adopted the title King of all Nairi, a symbolic expression of dominance rather than evidence of lasting control. Other texts speak of dozens of local rulers within Nairi, suggesting a fragmented political landscape rather than a unified state. References to a great inland sea associated with Nairi clearly point to Lake Van, whose vast size and appearance led Assyrian scribes to describe it as an upper sea. Later, Assyrian rulers continued to use this terminology, reinforcing the region's symbolic importance. Additional inscriptions describe Assyrian armies crossing mountain ranges south of the region, further confirming that Nairi extended across much of Eastern Anatolia. By comparing references to rivers, valleys, and neighbouring lands, it becomes possible to outline the approximate boundaries of this vast area. From the eastern Taurus Mountains to the upper reaches of the Great Zab and northward toward Erzurum, Nairi encompassed nearly all of what is now Eastern Anatolia. At times, the name Nairi referred to this broad region as a whole. In other contexts, it denoted smaller political units within it. The same flexibility appears in later uses of the term Urartu. This layered geography reflects how Assyrian writers understood space not as fixed borders, but as shifting zones of influence. The regions later associated with Nairi were also areas once inhabited by Hurrian populations. Linguistic parallels and historical references support this continuity. When a Hurrian ruler fled into Nairi territory after defeat, it reinforced the region's role as a cultural and political refuge. The later adoption of Nairi as a royal title by Urartian kings may therefore represent a conscious effort to link their authority to an older Hurrian tradition and legacy. Drawing a clean geographic line between the names Urartu, Urartu, and Nairi is far more difficult than it first appears. In the 11th century BCE, Assyrian sources used the label Nairi to describe a vast stretch of territory, while Urartu or Urartu seems, at least at that time, to have referred to a smaller zone. Even though both names shifted in meaning over the centuries and could expand or contract depending on political circumstances, they were consistently treated as separate political spaces. The Assyrian records make a clear distinction. Neither Urartu nor any of its component regions was understood as belonging to Nairi. Despite their geographic proximity, the two terms were kept apart in the language of Imperial geography. Both names were applied to major Hurrian and early Urartian groupings across the Eastern Anatolian Highlands. These communities likely rose in importance after the collapse of older powers that had once dominated the wider region. Yet the record does not preserve a local historical tradition, from within these highland societies. That absence creates a major trap. Similar tribal names and repeating place names should not be treated as fixed facts that map neatly onto stable political units. Mountain landscapes did not function like the open lowlands of Mesopotamia. Numerous tribes, multiple languages, and shifting alliances could coexist in close proximity, while many groups may have moved seasonally or changed their zones of influence. Place names recorded by outsiders could easily reflect foreign labels, translations, or administrative shortcuts rather than local speech. Within this uncertainty, a rare moment of overlap appears in the Annals of Tiglath-Pileser I. Two districts once described as belonging to Urartu are later listed under a different label, connected to a land called Habhi. Some scholars have imagined Habhi as an early tribal federation, linked to what would later become the Urartian world, but the evidence is too thin to treat that as a settled conclusion. The safer reading is that the labels used by Assyria could drift, overlap, or be reassigned as campaigns and frontier pressures changed. Between the 11th and 9th centuries, BCE stretches a long, poorly documented period, roughly 4 centuries in which many tribal groups appear briefly and then vanish from view. The events recorded from this era are fragmented and often impossible to connect into a continuous narrative. Even so, the period can be seen as a preparatory phase. Shifting coalitions, repeated pressures from the south, and the gradual shaping of the political environment from which a later kingdom would emerge. The precise relationship between the later Urartian language and earlier Hurrian populations remains uncertain in the written record, yet one point stands out in how the story appears from the outside. As Assyria's northern rival began to take shape, Urartu emerged in the imperial imagination as the successor to earlier powers that had once resisted Assyrian influence. By the 9th century BCE, the geographic and political background of the region had become highly complex. Across the arc between the Middle Taurus and the Zagros Mountains, a dense mosaic of small states and frontier polities filled the landscape. In the west, Neo-Hittite kingdoms occupied key corridors and cities. Farther east, along the Middle Euphrates, Aramaean states controlled strategic river routes and fortified centres. Some territories remain hard to place with confidence, but the overall picture is clear enough. Multiple powers shared borderlands that were constantly tested by raids, tribute demands, shifting alliances, and major imperial campaigns. To the north and northeast, mountainous districts rich in metal resources held particular importance. One such zone, widely associated with later descriptions of Hubushkia, is often placed near the Upper Zab or the adjacent highlands. The region's reputation for mineral wealth is reinforced by traces of strong ironworking traditions found in the wider area. Nearby lay a small but extremely significant state, Musasir, whose importance in the Urartian religious world would later become decisive. It was remembered as the main cult centre of Haldi, the chief god of Urartu. Many reconstructions place Musasir in the high valleys of what is now northern Iraq, where a local place name may preserve an echo of the ancient city. West of Lake Urmia, another land known as Gilzanu is usually located along the lake's western shore, though some arguments place it farther south. A major settlement associated with the region, often identified with the great site of Hassanlu, appears to have been a central node in that landscape. During the early 9th century BCE, this district was valued for one especially practical reason in Assyrian eyes. It supplied horses regarded as particularly good. 4 states in particular, Kume, Musasir, Hubushkia, and Gilzanu, appear repeatedly as Assyria's northern neighbours. At certain moments, their rulers even appear in ceremonial contexts, tied to Assyrian royal display, suggesting that diplomacy, intimidation, and political theatre could accompany military pressure. Beyond the Zagros range, other names fill the records: Parsua, Manea, and a land associated with the Medes. Parsua is especially revealing because it signals the early presence of groups that would later be linked with the Persians and their movement toward the region known in later times as Fars. Manea appears as a mixed cultural zone shaped by multiple older traditions and populations. The Median lands enter the record as Assyrian armies push deeper into the Zagros frontier. From the viewpoint preserved in Assyrian writing, the unification of the Urartian groups in the 9th century BCE was completed under military pressure from the south. It is described as a process of consolidation that turned scattered highland polities into something capable of resisting a major empire. Within that narrative, 3 figures stand out as key actors in the formation of the kingdom during the 9th century: Aramu, Sarduri, and Ishpuini. Aramu is the earliest ruler whose name is clearly linked to the land called Urartu in these records. Assyrian annals report victories over him during the reign of Shalmaneser III. In one campaign, a fortified city named Sugunia is captured and burned. Soon after, another stronghold described as the royal residence falls as well. Even through the filter of Assyrian propaganda, something important becomes visible. The texts speak not only of villages, but of fortified centres and royal residences. That language implies an already organised political structure with defended nodes and an established leadership. Beyond his opposition to Assyria, little can be stated with certainty about Aramu. His name has led some to suspect an Aramaean connection, because it resembles names used in Aramaean contexts. The fact that later Urartian dynasties did not continue to use the name may hint at a change of ruling house, the kind of dynastic break seen in other regions and periods. The wider environment makes such a scenario plausible. Many zones once influenced by older great powers experienced deep Aramaean cultural expansion over time, producing small Aramaean kingdoms that later became targets of Assyrian conquest and provincial rule. Against that backdrop, it is possible to imagine a founder figure who attempted to build defensive networks and rally highland communities against increasing imperial pressure. History offers parallels where the threat of a powerful neighbour pushed scattered groups toward unity, fortification, and state formation. Locating the earliest Urartian centres remains difficult. The sources are sparse, and the place names they preserve are tied closely to military routes, rather than to careful geographic description. Campaign narratives, shaped by formulaic language, often compress distances and smooth over logistical realities. Even so, later comparisons of campaign routes suggest that some Assyrian expeditions followed broadly similar corridors across the same frontier zones. This has led to repeated attempts to reconstruct marching lines and identify cities, passes, and lakes mentioned in the texts. One striking example concerns the Sea of Nairi mentioned in a campaign account. While many interpretations assume this refers to Lake Van, another possibility is Lake Urmia. The choice matters because it shifts the likely location of key cities, such as Sugunia. Competing reconstructions place the related lands either in valleys toward the upper Zab or farther southeast along routes leading toward the Zagros. Each option solves some problems while creating others. A southern placement, for example, can make the campaign route seem implausibly distant from the political heartland that later defines Urartu. A broader solution has been proposed to explain these tensions. Instead of treating one long campaign narrative as a single continuous expedition, the record may preserve a stitched summary of two separate operations, one aimed toward the Euphrates sources and another aimed toward the Zagros frontier. Such a compilation would explain why the described return routes and mountain passes do not align neatly. It would also explain how standard narrative patterns could be reused to give the appearance of a seamless story. Similar editorial practices are known elsewhere in Assyrian royal inscriptions, where the priority was not precise geography but royal prestige. A later campaign description that again names Aramu offers another window into this frontier world. It portrays an Assyrian king moving into Nairi, erecting a monument, entering a mountain pass, forcing the submission of territories linked with Urartu, reaching the source region of the Euphrates, performing rituals, and then continuing into other lands before returning through the west. Physical traces of Assyrian monuments near the headwaters of the Tigris still mark how important these symbolic acts were. Such monuments were designed to turn distant landscapes into remembered spaces of imperial power. From the 9th century record alone, a few cautious conclusions about Aramu can be drawn. Despite reported defeats early on, he appears to have retained enough strength to remain politically significant for many years. His rule seems long, though its exact beginning and end are unknown. During that time, conditions in the highlands allowed the formation of a state-like structure. Whether this was solely his achievement or the culmination of earlier local developments cannot be proven. Yet the repeated references to strongholds and royal residences suggest that the political foundations were already substantial. At the same time, the period offers a frustrating silence in one crucial area. No native Urartian inscriptions survive from Aramu's reign. The earliest Urartian texts appear later, under Sarduri. These are carved on the rock face at Van, at the base of what became the citadel associated with the early kingdom. Multiple copies of the same Assyrian language text were inscribed there, presenting Sarduri with a full royal style. A great king, a strong king, king of the land, king of Nairi, a ruler who claims unmatched status and the submission of other kings. The inscription describes the building of a major wall and emphasizes the transport of massive stone blocks from a place called Al-Niunu. Sarduri is often treated as a second founder figure, because under him the political centre appears clearly anchored at Van. The choice of Tuspa as a royal residence and the effort to fortify it marks a new phase in the kingdom's visibility. The fact that Sarduri links himself to a father named Lutibri rather than to Aramu suggests a dynastic change, possibly even a change in tribal base. Whatever the exact background, Sarduri stands at the beginning of the ruling house that would govern the kingdom until its eventual collapse centuries later. The location of Al-Niunu remains uncertain. Some interpretations see it as a nearby quarry south of Van, chosen for practical reasons. Another line of thought imagines a deeper political meaning. The transport of stone from an older centre could symbolize the relocation of authority to a newly defined capital. A third idea considers whether Al-Niunu and the title King of Nairi reflect political connections with neighbouring regions historically labelled as Nairi. None of these proposals can be confirmed with the evidence currently available. Still, the inscription preserves something valuable. It implies the existence of earlier fortified sites and organised labour capable of quarrying, moving, and placing enormous stone blocks. That fits the broader picture already hinted at in Assyrian accounts describing fortified cities in the highlands. Because direct Urartian records are absent for the earliest phase, Aramu's historical role has to be reconstructed largely from assumptions. Yet, the emerging outline remains striking. The early highland polity was not merely a loose cluster of tribes. It appears as a power capable of building strongholds, maintaining royal residences, adopting monumental self-presentation and gradually turning a contested frontier into a kingdom with a clear centre. Even if writing and certain artistic forms were influenced by Assyria, the desire to mark authority in stone reveals a political ambition that predates the later, better documented expansion of the Urartian state. So far, archaeology has not produced a fortress that can be dated with certainty to the first half of the 9th century BCE, the very period when the Urartian state is expected to be taking shape. A few strongholds have been identified around Lake Sivan that may belong to an earlier stage, possibly even before Urartu, yet these lie far to the north of the main arena where the kingdom's formation unfolded. This gap matters because it forces the story to lean more heavily on written evidence. Even the names of places hint at patterns that are hard to prove but difficult to ignore. Several early toponyms share a similar ending, suggesting a local naming habit that later became widespread across the region's landscape. At the beginning of Urartian written history, the key surviving text is not in the local language at all. It is written in Assyrian. The most plausible explanation is straightforward. An Assyrian scribe, unfamiliar with the native tradition of monumental writing in the Urartian Highlands, produced a text by copying what he already knew. The language follows habits learned from letters and official introductions. It even uses a word associated with clay tablets, rather than the normal expression used for stone inscriptions. That detail does not necessarily mean the text truly began life on clay. It suggests the scribe fell back on the formulae he had been trained to use. The king's titles tell a similar story. Aside from the label King of Nairi, the full sequence matches Assyrian royal style closely, especially the patterns used in the reign of Assur-Nasir-Pal II and the early years of Shalmaneser III. Several of these expressions had already started to fade from use in Shalmaneser's time. This is important because it implies that the borrowing of writing practices began earlier than the surviving inscription itself. If writing had arrived only with Sarduri, the obvious choice would have been to use the contemporary formulas of Shalmaneser III. Instead, the titles look like they come from a slightly older template. That observation supports the idea that writing may have been used in the Urartian sphere already in the time of Aramu, even though no inscription of his has been found. There is little reason to treat Urartian writing as an inherited local tradition reaching back to the Bronze Age kingdoms of the region. The stronger explanation is cultural transfer from Assyria, Urartu's most powerful rival. In a landscape where many peoples lived side by side, writing was more than record-keeping. It was a tool of government, a means of organising labour and tribute, a device for turning victories into permanent claims, a weapon of diplomacy that could travel farther than armies. The earliest Urartian inscription can be described as simple and not yet fully mature, yet it already points toward a political program that would soon become very real. Within only a couple of generations, Urartian power would extend far beyond the older geographic idea of Nairi. This spread of the cuneiform world from Mesopotamia into the surrounding mountains was not unique to Urartu. It appears in scattered but telling examples across neighbouring highlands. A small political entity near a lake in the Zagros also shows awareness of Assyrian writing. Farther west and south, an inscribed object found at Hasanlu suggests that writing circulated through the lands south of Lake Urmia as well. Another document, discovered much later in the heart of Media, preserves a legal or administrative note connected with an Assyrian captive who was released. These fragments belong to different moments and remain difficult to align into a single clear timeline, yet together they show that literacy in Assyrian form could appear wherever politics and pressure created the need for it. One further detail stands out. When the earliest Urartian inscriptions are compared with later royal texts. In the later period, the name of Haldi dominates state ideology. In Sarduri's inscriptions, however, Haldi is absent. A partially preserved religious text, written in Assyrian, carved on the southern slope of the Van Rock, also avoids naming Haldi, even though its script and style resemble the inscriptions associated with Sarduri. This repeated silence is unlikely to be accidental. It points to a political reason rather than a religious one. The key lies in geography. The main cult centre of Haldi was located at Musasir, a place outside the direct political borders of early Urartu. The Haldi tradition itself seems older than the kingdom that later adopted it. The divine element, Haldi, appears in personal names already in the Middle Assyrian period, and it is not restricted only to people who would later be considered Urartian. That wider spread raises a fundamental question. Was Haldi always a native Urartian god, or did the kingdom adopt an established cult from a neighbouring sacred centre and then elevate it to national status? The available evidence strengthens the second possibility. Nothing proves that Haldi began as the national deity of Urartu from the start, and several factors make a direct Hurrian origin less likely than older assumptions once suggested. The most convincing reconstruction treats Haldi's rise as part of state formation itself, not as a timeless inheritance. That transformation appears most clearly in the reign of Ishpuini, Sarduri's son. With Ishpuini, the Urartian state takes on the main features that would define it for generations. Numerous inscriptions and monumental works present the image of a well-organized kingdom for its time. From this point forward, documents in the Urartian language become more common and begin to cover a wide range of subjects. Military campaigns, foundation of cities and temples, agriculture, religious practice, building programs, and the production of metalwork. The surviving texts from Ishpuini's reign fall into two broad types. Some are short foundation inscriptions, often placed on bases or architectural elements, designed to mark royal patronage. Others are longer and more detailed. Ritual texts, construction records, and campaign narratives. In many of these longer inscriptions, Ishpuini appears alongside his son, Minua. In a few construction texts, even Minua's son is named. These family references become essential because Urartu did not consistently use the dating systems familiar from Mesopotamia. Later, kings occasionally used year names in rare cases, yet the regular practice of dating documents was never fully adopted. As a result, genealogy becomes one of the few reliable tools for establishing sequence. The repeated pairing of Ishpuini and Minua has another implication. It suggests that Ishpuini's authority, or at least the public representation of his power, intensifies after a form of shared rule begins. Even so, the administrative and cultural developments that made such public writing possible must have started earlier, in the first years of his reign, when the state's institutions were being strengthened. A bilingual inscription from Kelesin shows Ishpuini continuing the familiar royal style inherited from the previous generation. It still carries earlier titles such as Great King and King of Nairi, and it still draws on Assyrian patterns such as Mighty King. Yet for the first time, new national elements appear clearly. The land is named in its local form, Biainili. The capital is named as Tuspa. Most crucially, the national god Haldi is mentioned. None of these appear in Sarduri's inscriptions. This shift signals a turning point. The kingdom is no longer presenting itself only through borrowed imperial formulas. It is now asserting its own centre, its own name, and its own divine protector. The political meaning of this change is likely deep. Under Sarduri, the ruling group associated with Biainili gained control over the peoples living between the eastern Taurus ranges and the Lake Van Basin. Fortification systems already present in the earlier phase appear to expand and become more systematic. Tuspa emerges as a new royal centre tied to a new dynasty. Ishpuini continues this trajectory, but also makes a critical ideological move. By linking himself and his family to Haldi, he anchors the dynasty to a sacred authority whose most important sanctuary lay at Musasir. Musasir was not originally inside the Urartian political core, and Haldi does not appear to have belonged to the early inner pantheon of Urartu in the way the storm god and sun god did. Those older deities were widely shared across related cultures. Haldi, by contrast, seems connected to a cult network that spread from Musasir outward into Upper Mesopotamia. The name of Haldi's consort appears in the Musasir tradition, while Urartian texts sometimes use a local variant. This pattern resembles a process of adaptation, where an established cult is absorbed, reshaped, and then placed at the centre of state ideology. Sacred centres like Musasir and Kume also functioned beyond the boundaries of any single kingdom. They were international shrines in the ancient Near East, places that attracted attention, gifts, and political interest. In that context, the absence of divine names in Sarduri's inscriptions begins to look less mysterious. If Haldi had not yet been made the national god, there would have been no reason to foreground him. The moment Haldi becomes central, the kingdom's message changes. A new religious focus becomes part of a political strategy, uniting mountain communities under one dynasty, one ideology, one shared divine protector, particularly under the pressure of Assyrian threat. It mirrors the way Assyria used the Assur cult as a core element of unity and legitimacy. From this stage onward, Urartian history can be reconstructed primarily through local inscriptions, because they become the main narrative voice. The earliest Urartian war accounts still resemble Assyrian models in structure and tone, showing how strongly they were shaped by borrowed literary forms. At the same time, they already contain the components that later appear in full in the inscriptions of Argishti I and Sarduri II, the language of divine support, the listing of victories, the building of fortresses, the transformation of conquered space into named territory. A new type of monument introduced in Ishpuini's time, the border stela, also reveals the strategic directions of expansion. These texts describe campaigns northward across the Araxes toward trans-Caucasian peoples, and southeastward toward the Lake Urmia basin. The northern operations appear repeatedly across later reigns, which suggests that the region was never fully subdued. The campaigns were often closer to raids, designed for wealth and pressure, than to permanent annexation. Even so, these northern targets remained a constant military focus. The southeast, however, offers a different kind of evidence because it connects inscriptions with later geographic identifications and archaeological destruction layers. A stela associated with Ishpuini and Minua, set up near a lake east of Van, describes the conquest of fertile valleys south of Lake Urmia. The text presents victory as the result of Haldi's power, then lists the target cities taken, the military forces involved, and the scale of deportations and booty. Chariots, cavalry, infantry, captives, livestock, and valuable animals are counted in a style typical of ancient royal display. The tone is not neutral. It is meant to proclaim dominance and reshape memory. Yet when this account is compared with other evidence, it gains sharper meaning. Urartian inscriptions contain a brief but striking detail. Alongside references that echo earlier Assyrian usage, they also mention a group identified as Pasua, a name connected with the earliest historical notices of the Persians. The problem is that the Urartian texts stop almost immediately. They offer no narrative explanation, no origin story, no description of movements, and no account of how these people lived. It is only a passing reference, yet it has large consequences. That short remark allows the Pasua presence to be placed broadly in the period between about 820 and 810 BCE. If that placement is accepted, the most plausible setting for Pasua lies south of Lake Urmia, in the plains between modern centres such as Nagadeh, Mahabad, and Miandoab. Material remains from Hassanlu's later Iron Age levels have often been linked with the same setting, though certainty depends on how one particular inscription is read. The key difficulty is grammatical rather than dramatic. In one text, several city names appear near the name of the land itself. It is not perfectly clear whether these cities are being listed as part of that land, or whether the wording implies a relationship of belonging. The difference sounds small, yet it matters. Either way, the most reasonable conclusion is that the named cities fall within the Pasua sphere. The inscription is too short to settle the question decisively, but it points in the same direction as other clues. Another discovery in the same southern Lake Urmia region strengthens the picture. In the late 1960s, an American survey in the fertile Godar River Plain revealed an important inscription near the fortified hill known today as Kalatka. It was found close to the site of Ushnavie, and it carries the names of Ishpuini and Minua. The text functions as direct testimony that these kings pushed into the region and claimed it as conquered ground. Taken together with the earlier stela that names Mesta, the find supports a long-standing identification of that city with Hassanlu. It also helps place Pasua more firmly in the landscape. Other mounds in the area could, in theory, be candidates for some of the named places, but the overall framework remains stable. The same stela lists additional towns, showing that this was not a single strike at one settlement, but pressure across a wider local network. Even if written sources alone cannot prove every detail, the archaeological pattern adds weight. In the period tied to Ishpuini and Minua, Urartian construction appears both east and west of Hassanlu. Fortresses rise in strategic positions. In the next stage of Hassanlu's history, a substantial city wall emerges. This sequence makes best sense if Hassanlu's earlier cultural horizon collapsed through conflict, after which a new and more organised Iron Age order developed across parts of northwestern Iran. The evidence does not need to be read as a single dramatic turning point. It fits a slow process of takeover, consolidation, and rebuilding, with military pressure as the catalyst. Before the Godar Plain and the Solduz Basin could be secured, a more basic step had to occur. Access routes had to be controlled. The Urartian state could not project power toward Lake Urmia without maintaining the link between the Urmia Basin and the capital region around Tuspa. Archaeological traces and inscriptions confirm Urartian presence along that line of movement. The most important early road toward Azerbaijan appears to have started at Van, then angled northeast toward the area of Lake Erchek. The position of the Karagunduz stela is significant here because it stands near the corridor itself. From there, the route runs through the Kotor Valley, crosses the Zagros Ranges, and drops into the Urmia Basin. This was not simply a convenient path. It was a controlled channel through harsh terrain, the kind of passage a state would rely on when it needed reliable movement of troops, supplies, and authority. A second major inscription reveals a different side of the same expansion: religion as statecraft. The Kelesin stela, set on a high mountain pass, describes a royal act that is both political and sacred. The monument is bilingual, with Urartian on one side and Assyrian on the other. It belongs to the group of texts where Ishpuini and Minua appear together, and it describes a journey to Musashir, the great sanctuary of the god Haldi. The text makes clear that the visit was not casual devotion, it was royal theatre and a declaration of legitimacy. Offerings are listed. Ritual actions are presented as public proof. Haldi is treated not as a distant divine name, but as the central authority under which the dynasty places itself. Even where exact wording remains difficult to interpret, the meaning of the scene is plain. Ishpuini speaks in the first person, presenting himself as the active ruler who dedicates monuments and sets the rules of piety. Through that voice, the dynasty is explicitly linked to Haldi's protection. At the same time, authority is being asserted in the territory around Musashir. That point becomes even clearer when later evidence shows how central the sanctuary remained. For a long time, the shrine's approval seems to have carried political weight that extended beyond simple worship. In later decades, Urartian royal legitimacy could be described as incomplete without Haldi's sanction, to the extent that the symbols of power were not treated as fully valid without proper connection to the god's sacred centre. The arrival of Haldi's cult in the Urartian state cannot be dated to a single moment. It likely unfolded in stages, culminating in a major institutional statement. The open-air sanctuary known today for its long inscription that defines the state cult's structure. The significance lies not only in architecture, but in what the text does. It fixes a ritual program describing the offerings due to each deity, ordering divine ranks and presenting the pantheon as a formal system. The seasonal rhythm of sacrifice appears tied to the agricultural cycle, implying that divine protection was expected to cover harvest, vineyards, herds, and the continuity of life itself. In this vision, Haldi is not only a war god marching before kings. He becomes a guardian of the economic foundations of society, fields, animals, and the stable return of seasons. The list of gods preserved in this setting is extensive. It begins with a high triad: Haldi, alongside the storm, god Tesheba, and the sun, god Shivini. Beyond them, many other divine names appear, including deities and sacred forces that seem rooted in local regions. The pattern suggests a familiar imperial habit. As Urartu expanded, the gods of newly conquered lands were absorbed into the state pantheon. The list functions almost like a religious map. It reflects the territories held at the time the text was fixed, making the pantheon a mirror of political geography. Later discoveries have confirmed this approach. Two deities that appear in the list without explanation were identified much later as local gods from the Lake Urmia region, which supports the conclusion that Urartu had already pushed beyond the Zagros edge and incorporated those lands into its system by Ishpuini's time. Absences are just as informative. A local deity from the Ararat plain, later honoured by Argishti I in a new northern centre, does not appear in the earlier list. The simplest explanation is chronological. That region had not yet been brought under Urartian control when the list was composed. Another name in the list helps locate borders even more sharply. A deity linked with a mountain known from later campaign accounts marks a boundary zone between Musashir and Assyrian territory. That detail implies that, by the time the list was formalised, Musashir had already been placed firmly within the Urartian sphere, at least in political terms. How early Musashir was brought under Urartian influence remains difficult to pin down. Sources for the reign of Sarduri are too thin to answer whether initial moves began even then. Even so, when the Pantheon list is read alongside campaign inscriptions and border stelae, a broad sequence becomes visible. Expansion moved toward Lake Urmia and its western shore. The conquest of Mesta, likely Hassanlu, followed, bringing the first clear contact with Pasua. Control then deepened in the southern plains of the Urmia Basin, where fortresses such as Kalatga appear as signs of colonization and long-term planning. A sacred corridor was established between the Ushnavia Valley and Musasir, effectively a state-controlled pilgrimage route. A Urartian governorship in the Musasir region becomes a logical outcome of that process. This sequence cannot be treated as fixed. Musasir may have been taken in more than one stage. Early pressure followed by full control only after the wider Urmia Basin was secured. Campaigns to the north, into Transcaucasia, are even harder to place in time because the inscriptions do not provide reliable dating markers. Still, the direction of change is clear. Eastern and southeastern expansion, followed by consolidation across the valleys of Ushnavie, Soldus, and Mahabad, laid the foundation for later moves farther south into Mania, and then along the Zagros margins into richer zones of Iranian Kurdistan. That widening frontier also widened the zone of friction with Assyria. By the end of the next century, conflict with the great rival becomes almost unavoidable. One final geographic point explains why the chosen route to Musasir may look unusually long on a map. The terrain did not permit a safe, direct, and north-south connection across the high mountains. Natural barriers still shape travel today. For that reason, it is not surprising the Urartian movement toward Musasir repeatedly followed the Van Erchek, Kotor Urmia Ushnavie, Kelesin corridor, at least until the time of Sargon's famous campaign in 714 BCE. Evidence from a later stela indicates that this sacred road remained consistent for roughly a century. In practical terms, this suggests that Urartu controlled the Godar Valley and parts of the Urmia Basin, while the rugged Hakkari region and the zone between the Hakkari Mountains and the Middle Zab remained outside firm Urartian control. That area was isolated and dangerous, surrounded by steep terrain that resisted easy integration. Even in later periods, it never became a simple highway of connection. During the centuries before Assyria's major intervention, the Hakkari zone belonged to a small kingdom often linked with Nairi in outside descriptions, a land known as Hubushkia. Urartian texts do not use that name, which is surprising given its proximity and the claims Urartu later made in the broader region. Yet different languages naming the same land in different ways is common in the ancient Near East. It remains possible that Hubushkia appears under another label in Urartian sources. A name in Argishti, the first's Annals, resembles a royal name associated with Hubushkia in wider cuneiform literature, hinting at a hidden overlap. Even the names used for Musasir reflect deep cultural layers. In Urartian, the city is also known as Ardini, a term whose meaning becomes clear when traced to older languages of the mountains. It carries the simple sense of the city, a label that suggests how central the sanctuary was for people living in the highlands. The idea is not unique in history. Major capitals often become the city in everyday speech. Yet Urartu also shows difference from older traditions. The Urartian term for a fortified city does not mirror the older word. It reflects a newer model of the stronghold state, the kind of urban form Urartu was creating across its frontiers. The political structure behind these developments raises a separate problem: the question of shared rule. In many of Ishpuini's major inscriptions, his son Minua is named, and in 2 cases even a grandson appears. This has encouraged the idea of a co-regency, but the evidence does not settle the matter. In the known inscriptions, Ishpuini's name comes first, and is usually accompanied by full royal titles. Minua often appears only as a named participant or sponsor. That pattern alone cannot prove that both ruled as equals. The same uncertainty applies to claims that father and son personally campaigned together. The texts provide no clear chronological framework, and the repeated pairing could reflect dynastic messaging, rather than literal joint command. A later set of inscriptions offers the strongest argument for shared authority near the end of Ishbuini's life. These texts, found near the northeastern shore of Lake Van, describe major building works and agricultural measures in newly founded settlements. They can be divided into parallel series, some emphasizing Ishbuini, others emphasizing Minua, yet many formulas invoke both names. The simplest reading is that responsibility was shared, at least in the administration of these large projects. That does not establish a formal co-kingship, beyond doubt, but it strengthens the possibility that Urartu experimented with a period of joint governance as a way to secure succession and maintain momentum during a crucial phase of expansion. No Assyrian record from Minua's own lifetime, and none from later periods either, speaks about him by name. Everything known about his actions must be reconstructed from local voices, Urartu's own inscriptions and the physical traces left on the landscape. A remarkably large portion of the texts recovered so far belongs to his reign, and many of them carry real historical claims. Campaigns, conquests, foundations, and projects meant to endure. Their discovery sites are not confined to the shores of Lake Van. They appear far beyond the core region, scattered across valleys and passes, sometimes in places that would only matter if Urartu had already pushed authority outward. The distribution itself becomes evidence. It outlines the reach of the kingdom in Minua's time, as much as any written line does. Under Minua, Urartu expands in multiple directions at once. To the west, forces press toward the Euphrates line. To the north, the Aras plain is finally drawn into the orbit, and new settlements are planted just south of it. To the southeast, power begins to lean across the Zagros, bringing Urartu close enough to threaten the lands associated with Manea. To the south, movement enters the Upper Tigris region, where the Urartian frontier approaches territory controlled by Assyria. The picture is of a state no longer testing its borders, but actively shaping them, probing weak points, building footholds and turning raids into something closer to long-term control. Even so, the sequence of events remains difficult to pin down. Reliable dating tools for this expansion phase are missing. Unlike the rulers who come after him, Minua does not leave behind a clear year-by-year narrative that lists campaigns and building projects in a strict order. There are no surviving annals that provide an organized timeline. One rare exception stands out. 2 historical texts carved inside the fortress at Anzavur-Tepe near Patnos. These inscriptions preserve a short summary that presents itself as the first phase of Minua's reign, and it begins with a clear transitional statement. When Minua, son of Ishbuini, took his father's throne, he moved with the backing and command of the god Haldi. That opening frames what follows as early actions, likely belonging to the first years after succession. The text then describes an uprising in a land called Satiru. The narrative uses a familiar imperial rhythm. Rebellion is announced, divine sanction is invoked, a weapon is lifted in the god's name, fortified places fall. 2 cities are defeated first, then the territory is brought under control. The campaign pushes onward from one named city toward Bustu and Malmali, suggesting a wide route rather than a single siege. The same year, another land called Alzi rises in revolt. Again, the story insists that Haldi goes ahead of the king, a ritual way of portraying victory as inevitable. The king defeats a city at the heart of the resistance, occupies Alzi, and takes over parts of the neighbouring area associated with Samu. The text closes this sequence by noting construction at the captured city, implying that conquest is not complete until stone and administration follow. Even in this early fragment, the style already resembles the later Urartian tradition that becomes common under Minua's successors. A compact report, heavy on place names, presenting campaigns as proof of legitimacy. Yet the Annals of Urartu text describes only a beginning. The crucial question is where these targets lay. One of them, Bustu, appears in Assyrian geographical knowledge as well, pointing toward an Iranian setting south of the Parsua region. Alzi, however, is also known under the same name in Hittite and Assyrian contexts along the Murat River, and that pushes its location toward the west. The result is striking. The early account seems to imply two different axes of movement, one reaching east or southeast toward Armenian Highland territory, another driving west toward the Euphrates system. The fortress of Anzavurtepe helps explain how that could work. Patnos sits on a major corridor. From the northern edge of Lake Van, routes run along the valley of the Bendimahi River toward the upper Murat Basin. From there, following the river's flow, can lead toward the Euphrates. If the inscription is taken seriously, Minua, in the first year after his father's death, launched two separate expeditions, one toward northwestern Iran, another toward the western riverlands. The construction and inscriptions at Anzavurtepe itself likely belong to the aftermath of the Western Push, presented as a monument of gratitude to Haldi after success. The Western campaign does not end there. Once Alzi is subdued and Urartian authority is strengthened, further operations toward the Murat and Euphrates become easier. Another inscription, carved at Palu on the Murat River, shows Minua moving into a region later known as Sofin. The text indicates that he occupied that land and forced the king of Malatya to pay tribute. That detail matters because it implies crossing the Euphrates. From that point onward, the Euphrates becomes a natural boundary for Urartu in the west, a powerful line that both separates and defines ambition. This western entry into the old Hittite sphere makes most sense as a continuation of the Alzi operation. It becomes a forward base for later actions directed farther west. The Palu inscription also supports the geography suggested by the Anzavurtepe narrative. If Minua could advance that far in the opening phase of his reign, then the Mush plain and the zone north of it, around the Kayaladere fortress, must already have been under Urartian influence during Ishpuini's later years. From that staging area, Minua later pushed across the Taurus toward the Batman River region, an area that may correspond to the land known in Assyrian memory as Subria, a mountainous refuge zone associated with Hurrian withdrawal in earlier centuries. The campaign suggests not only expansion, but a deliberate interest in corridors linking highlands to Mesopotamian fringes. The Iranian-facing side of Minua's policy continues as well. A rock inscription at Tashtepe, south of Lake Ermita, echoes the first campaign described at Anzavurtepe, or presents it as a follow-up. Here, a broader pattern becomes visible. Urartu, like Assyria, often returns repeatedly to the same targets. Many expeditions appear less like permanent annexation and more like short, forceful strikes. Raids designed to break resistance, seize wealth, and reinforce claims, even if long-term occupation remains unstable. Later, kings will repeat this behaviour annually against Mania, which shows how the system works. Pressure is applied again and again until the region becomes accustomed to tribute, fear, or negotiated compliance. At the same time, Assyria is active on its own eastern front. The Assyrian ruler of this period conducts campaigns toward Mania and Media, and evidence also points to interventions in Syria and Anatolia. Boundary stelae record official actions taken to impose settlements between rival polities, with military presence used as the final argument. This matters because Urartu is also pressing westward. The potential for conflict is obvious, yet geography delays it. Malatya, the kind of state Urartu tries to draw into its orbit, lies on one side of the Malatya Mountains, while the places tied more directly to Assyria lie on the other. The Eastern Taurus Range functions as a natural barrier, allowing both powers to expand in the same general direction without immediately colliding in open war. After the major Assyrian campaigns of the early 9th century and the consolidation of the Urartian kingdom, the eastern extensions of the Taurus begin to function as Urartu's southern boundary, holding Assyrian forces away from the older Nairi zones. Direct military clashes become likely only when Urartian armies cross that line. That turning point comes later, under another king, when Urartu openly challenges Assyria and suffers a defeat in the Commagene region. In Minua's time, the pattern is still one of probing, extending, and building strategic positions, rather than risking a decisive confrontation. Still, Urartian forces do cross into the south more than once. A fragmentary inscription attributed to Minua provides a compressed summary of southern operations toward the Upper Tigris. It cannot be securely dated, yet the place names align with Assyrian geography, which helps locate the action. 2 targets correspond to districts near Diyarbakir, along the bend of the Tigris. 2 others appear to lie farther southeast, near the Harbour Valley, close to the later frontier zone around Zakho. In boasting that he advanced beyond one region toward the land of Assur, Minua is claiming a deep penetration into a space that Assyria organized under provincial rule. Whether Urartu could hold such an advanced position is uncertain. The furthest confirmed line appears to be the Upper Tigris and the Harbour corridor, a southern limit that Urartian movement reaches but does not clearly turn into permanent control. Even so, the implications are significant. The matching of place names across the 2 traditions, combined with newer geographical work in northern Mesopotamia, suggests a temporary reversal of roles. Regions that had recently been under Assyrian pressure become exposed to successful Urartian incursions. Urartu is no longer merely resisting. It is sending armies into zones that have been considered part of Assyria's reach. Minua's energy is not limited to the south and west. In the north, the frontier toward Transcaucasia becomes another arena of success. Under Minua and the kings who follow, Urartu moves beyond the Aras and begins establishing new settlements in freshly taken lands. Evidence for this comes not only from the earlier Karahan stelae describing building and agricultural projects in newly founded towns, but also from a separate group of inscriptions discovered in the Ben Demahi Valley. These texts appear on stone blocks from a fortress at Kurzut and surrounding villages, clearly copied for placement on multiple structures. Many of the blocks belong to the facade of a tower temple, a strong hint that conquest is being translated into sacred architecture. Fragments of the same text were also found at Tuspa, suggesting that it may once have belonged to a larger royal record. The wide spread of the inscription shows that the events it praises were treated as major achievements. According to the text, Minua built a sanctuary dedicated to Haldi as an act of thanksgiving after a successful northern campaign. He claims to have subdued the lands of a people called Erikua, taken a capital said to have been untouched by previous sieges, and forced another land to provide tribute. The same northern coalition had already been fought during the period when Ishbuini and Minua appear together in earlier inscriptions. Now, the narrative presents a decisive breakthrough. The record lists loot in a way typical of royal propaganda: horses, cattle, sheep, and an inflated number of captives. It becomes more interesting when it describes relocation. Some captives are said to have been sent to Tuspur and to 2 other named cities. One of those cities seems to lie far away in the Urmia basin east of the Zagros. If that identification holds, it reveals an important administrative habit. Urartu, like Assyria, relocates prisoners across long distances. Captives are not only trophies, they are labour, population and leverage, moved to strengthen strategic zones or supply projects in the heartland. Minua also stamps the landscape with foundations. A city bearing his name, Minuahinili, appears on the right bank of the Aras, placed opposite the conquered Erikua region in the corridor between the mountain and the river. Another city of the same name is established in the Bendimahi Valley, and evidence suggests that a canal was built there. The Kurzut fortress itself may correspond to a city, founded jointly in the earlier period, a settlement that later texts connect with large building and agricultural measures. These northern routes were not random. A military road ran toward the Aras, while other roads reached toward Patnos and Malazgirt. Along these lines, Minua's inscriptions mention fortresses built to secure travel, supply, and control. Among them, the stronghold at Anzavurtepe, near Patnos, stands out as a key hinge between Lake Van's northern corridor and the westward path to the Mura and Euphrates. Another important target lies to the northwest, in a mountainous zone later famous in Greek accounts. At Yazalatash, near Khorasan, a rock inscription sits beside an old military route, and a second monument stands on the Erzurum to Kars line. These texts describe the conquest of a land known as Diawehi, and the capture of its capital, Sasilu. The record even preserves the name of its king, Utupurshini, who pays tribute in gold and silver. The same region appears earlier in Assyrian sources under a similar name, and the Erzurum area identification allows the 2 traditions to be connected. This campaign is best placed late in Minua's reign, largely because the same king of Diawehi is later defeated by Minua's successor, Argishti, in a separate record. The overlap suggests continuity. Minua breaks the region's resistance, then Argishti returns to finish the work. In the earliest phase of this period, written sources say very little about how the kingdom was governed day to day. The record is thin, almost silent on the details of administration. Yet once Minua's reign begins, the situation changes. Evidence multiplies. Archaeological traces appear across the landscape, while inscriptions provide a steady stream of names, places, and claims. Together, they offer a much clearer view of how the state worked. Not only how it fought. The texts still celebrate victories in the usual royal style, but they also talk about the practical business of control. Fortresses built after campaigns. New settlements planted in contested zones, and measures meant to turn conquered ground into productive territory. Some inscriptions focus on war, others show what follows after war. One report connected with the Alzi campaign states that after victory, Minua built a fortress at Kutume. It is described as a royal stronghold, a fixed point meant to hold what had been taken. The same text, though not perfectly clear in every line, also hints at economic planning. It speaks of fields, and it refers to a vineyard that is being established. Even when the wording is difficult, the intent is easy to see. Conquest is being followed by structured work on the land. This kind of planning is not limited to distant frontiers. In the central region around Lake Van, the same mentality appears on a larger scale. The clearest example is Minua's Great Water Project, recorded in many inscriptions and still visible today. Minua's most famous legacy is a canal system that continues to carry water in the modern landscape. It brings spring water from the southeast toward the capital region around Tuspa. For roughly 55 kilometers, the channel and its supporting structures cut across the terrain in a line that turns engineering into political statement. Local tradition later attached a legendary name to it, but the essential point is simpler. The project shows a state capable of mobilizing labor, surveying land, and maintaining infrastructure over long distances. In Minua's world, power is not only measured by walls and weapons. It is measured by the ability to reshape water, fields, and settlement. After Minua, the story moves into a new phase under his son Argishti. Even his succession is not fully transparent. Earlier, while Ishpuini was still alive, a different heir seems to have been expected. Minua's firstborn son, a prince named Inushpua. Several inscriptions preserve all three names, grandfather, father, and the prince, listed together as patrons. A separate dedication on a silver vessel, written in Assyrian, presents the prince receiving a gift, suggesting a close relationship between grandfather and grandson and a clear concern for dynastic continuity. Yet, Argishti becomes king instead. The reason is unknown. One possibility is that the expected heir died before Minua. Another possibility is darker, that a struggle inside the palace removed him, followed by a deliberate effort to erase his name from official memory. Only the official court record survives, and it does not explain the change. From the start of Argishti's reign, new kind of text becomes especially important. These records make it possible to arrange events in a relative order. They are often called annals because they follow a repeating pattern built around each campaign year. Each section begins with a short statement of military action. It presents the god Haldi going out with a weapon, crushing named lands, throwing defeated enemies at the king's feet. Then the king speaks in a formal voice, praising divine power, offering prayers to the leading gods of the kingdom, and declaring that those gods heard him. After that come the details: raids, sieges, building projects, the founding of towns, the movement of people. Each year ends with a tally of captives and livestock taken, followed by a closing formula that claims everything was achieved within a single year. The largest surviving rock inscription of this kind is carved at Van, on the southern face of the rock at Horhor, beside the entrance to the chambers that form Argishti's burial complex. The beginning is damaged, yet the missing opening can be reconstructed because a related stone copy preserves the key line. The text originally stated that Argishti received kingship through Haldi's will, then took his father's throne. That framing matters because it shows how the annals are meant to function. They are not only a record of events, they are an argument for legitimacy. Even the copies create problems. A group of stela fragments found in a church context includes parts that match the Horhor text closely, other parts that run parallel without being identical, and some sections that do not line up at all. That mixture suggests a process of selection and editing, rather than a simple one-to-one duplication. It also implies that certain texts existed earlier, then were gathered later for inscription on the rock monument. Argishti likely commissioned his burial complex late in his reign, which would explain why older events in the annals sometimes feel compressed or uneven. They had to be assembled from earlier records, leaving gaps and shortcuts. One example shows why this matters. Argishti's earliest campaigns, likely in his first or second year, targeted Diawehi and its king Utupurshini, the same region that had already confronted Minua. This suggests continuity. The new king follows the agenda set by his father. Yet one older reconstruction tried to place the Diawehi war very late in Argishti's reign, which creates an implausible time gap. A simpler explanation fits both the texts and the political logic. If Daiswehi had been forced to pay tribute under Menua, then the moment of succession at Tuspa could have looked like an opportunity. A subject kingdom might attempt to break free during a change of rulers. The annals themselves hint at this by describing Diawehi as rising again. Argishti responds by marching out, forcing the Diawehi king from his throne, taking another land called Seriazi, burning villages and tearing down fortifications. In this telling, the campaign is not a late return. It is an early act of reassertion. Other evidence supports that early dating. A rock inscription north of Kars, at Hanak, shows the wide reach of the same campaign. Argishti, in one sweep, also claims victories farther east in Transcaucasia over several named lands. Some of these can be placed beyond a branch of the Aras, in zones that correspond broadly to parts of modern Armenia. The great distance from Urartu's core helps explain a recurring pattern. Campaigns could be frequent because long-term control was difficult. When a region is far away, rebellion becomes easier, supply lines become harder, and a king may be forced to return repeatedly. The annals also present enormous figures for captives and animals. For this first phase, they claim more than 50,000 people taken, counted as men, women, and fighters. The livestock totals are even larger, with tens of thousands of cattle and more than 100,000 sheep. These numbers raise obvious questions. They often seem inflated. Still, the pattern within the figures is consistent. The counts are not rounded, as if they were copied from administrative lists, rather than invented as vague estimates. Ratios between cattle, sheep, and horses often look plausible, even when totals feel exaggerated. Camels appear rarely and in small numbers, which fits the expectation that camels would come mainly from more southern zones. From Argishti's second year, the annals show a familiar northern target, Etyuni, beyond the Aras. The region had already been a long-term opponent since the earlier period when Ishpuini and Minua appear together in texts. The third year shifts the scene to the west again. References emerge that point toward a landscape of late Hittite principalities. The wording implies that Urartu is not dealing with a single kingdom, but with multiple small states across the Euphrates world. As in Minua's time, the army moves across the river, reaches Malatia, then pushes into Tabal farther west. The fourth year returns to the north, toward the Sevan Lake region. Another campaign pushes deep into Transcaucasia, and the result is presented as lasting expansion. At this stage, Urartu is absorbing territory that broadly corresponds to a large part of the Armenian plateau. The foundation of a new fortress city near modern Yerevan, known later by the name Erebuni, fits this strategy. The new stronghold secures the fresh conquests. Its temple inscription places the city under the protection of a local god, showing again how state expansion absorbs local cults into a wider imperial framework. The annals also mention the transfer of large groups of fighting men from the west to the new northern city. This can be read as forced relocation, yet it also fits another practical interpretation. Troops are being moved as garrisons, repositioned from one frontier to another. The goal is control. A fortified city on a new border needs manpower, and a king who cannot permanently occupy every valley can still stabilize key nodes by placing soldiers where roads and passes can be watched. In the same year, another expedition targets a land known later under a different classical name. By the fifth year, the tone hardens toward the south. A line claims that Haldi's weapon went out and brought disaster upon Assyrian warriors. The phrase may refer to direct clashes with Assyrian forces, or it may point to Assyrian outposts in the Zagros region, rather than the Assyrian heartland itself. Either way, the direction of conflict has shifted. That same year, Argishti also engages Bustu, Barwata, Bahilu, Pasua, and the land of Mana. From this point on, Mana becomes an almost yearly target, and Pasua reappears in the record as well. Though the deeper question remains unanswered. How far south the Persians had moved by this time is still unclear, and no new inscription has yet appeared in the region to settle it. In the 6th year, the pattern repeats, with renewed southern activity and, for the first time in these entries, a larger number of camels listed among the loot. In following years, camels continue to appear in connection with Zagros warfare, reinforcing the idea that these campaigns are reaching into southern zones, where such animals were more common. A personal name also appears in the annals, identifying a man connected with an Assyrian-facing region. The same name resembles one known elsewhere as belonging to a ruler of Hubushkia, suggesting that Argishti's reach and diplomacy touched that mountain kingdom too. As the years pass, Argishti's targets remain largely stable. Mana in the southeast and Transcaucasia in the north. The 10th year stands out for a different reason. A new city is founded in the Araz Valley, bearing Argishti's name. It is not simply a fortress, it is an organized settlement project. A canal brings water into the Araz plain and turns the region into cultivated land that can feed and supply the northern frontier. Together with Erebuni, this foundation marks the completion of a major process. The Araz plain is being transformed into Urartian territory, both militarily secured and economically exploited. It becomes a strong base for repeated northern expeditions. Argishti's successes against Assyrian forces or Assyrian positions in the Zagros can be linked to a period of weakness inside Assyria after the death of one Assyrian king and before another fully stabilizes the throne. Yet Assyria does respond. Later, Assyrian references speak of a campaign directed against Argishti, led by an Assyrian commander. Official lists tied to Assyrian administration record years, marked by fighting against Urartu, clustering in the early part of Argishti's reign. The fragments are incomplete, yet the overlap is meaningful. The conflicts seem to take place south of the zone where Minua had achieved his earlier breakthroughs, in the same broad area where Assyria and Urartu spheres touched and overlapped. To the east and southeast, expansion along the Zagros appears to meet less organized resistance at first, especially when moving south from areas where Urartu had already planted colonies. Terrain, however, becomes the true enemy. The Zagros, like the Eastern Taurus, is a barrier that blocks easy movement. As the kingdom grows, another problem emerges: distance. Outposts, forts, and supply lines stretch farther from the capital, making every campaign harder to support. The solution is visible on the map. Control depends on a web of fortresses and garrisons spread across the expanded territory. Frontier strongholds are not only defensive points, they operate as royal stations, places where the king or commanders can reside, coordinate movements, store supplies, and supervise distant zones. The narrative then shifts again under Sarduri II, Argishti's son. For his reign, reconstruction becomes possible through a long annal text, carved at a sacred complex on the northern side of the Van Rock. The monument includes a tall standing stone with a base, plus surrounding rock surfaces covered with writing. Much of it was uncovered in early 20th century excavations. Today, it survives in fragments, some still on the spot, others preserved in the Van Museum, with only a small portion fully intact. The structure of Sarduri's annals follows the same pattern used by Argishti, which suggests that by this stage the annal format has become an established royal technology. There is also another major inscribed monument, associated with Sarduri II, one that complicates the record. It is a large standing stone once reused, in a church building. Only parts of its upper section were recovered, and it later disappeared. The surviving text shows that it was not a simple copy of the main annals. One face includes royal titles and a long curse formula, then a key sentence declaring that when Haldi granted him kingship, Sarduri sat on his father's throne. The remaining faces contained campaign narratives not included in the open-air complex text. This suggests that multiple official versions existed, each selecting events for its own purpose. The physical layout of the sacred complex strengthens this interpretation. One niche on the site appears to have been built to hold a second standing monument. The rock floor still shows a square depression shaped like the bed for a base. Another smaller socket cut into the same area looks like part of a system to anchor a tall stone securely. A separate base stone found elsewhere matches these measurements closely. It is plain, not inscribed, and lower than the base used for the monument that remains on the right side. The engineering implies a high stele designed to be locked into its base, then fixed again into the rock itself. The double anchoring points toward impressive height, an intention to dominate the space visually as much as the text dominates it rhetorically. On the eastern wall, inside the left niche, a later mark reveals a surprisingly precise clue about what happened to the monument that once stood there. An Armenian cross was carved into the surface, and beneath it an Armenian inscription dated to the year 949 was added. The message functions like a timestamp. By the mid-10th century, the space had already been repurposed, and the older stele had been removed from its original position. A second Armenian inscription associated with the nearby church, dated to 960, reinforces the same picture. The building history and the reuse of stone suggest a clear sequence. By that time, the site was no longer treated as an Urartian royal sanctuary. It had become part of a Christian landscape, with older elements displaced, reinterpreted, or simply harvested for new construction. Because so much has been moved, broken, or reused, reconstructing Sarduri's annals becomes a difficult puzzle. Some scholars attempted to arrange the surviving fragments into a timeline, proposing a reign that runs roughly from the mid-8th century into the later decades of that century. In their view, the text preserved on the Serp Pogos stele would reflect the early phase of Sarduri's rule, while the inscription associated with the right niche at the so-called Gate of the Treasury would preserve events from later years. The broad outline is plausible. A king's early years often carry the tone of consolidation and assertion, while later records tend to widen into longer lists of campaigns. Even so, the details of the reconstruction remain debated, and one of the key problems is the order in which the faces of a stele should be read. The traditional approach assumes a fixed sequence, yet the physical reality is more complicated. Different reading orders have been proposed. One approach reads front, back, left, then right. Another reads front, back, right, then left. A more convincing logic follows the direction of the script itself. If the writing runs to the right, then the sequence of faces should follow that movement. Front first, then the right face, then the back, then the left. Comparable examples exist where the continuation of the text requires precisely this rotation. For that reason, it makes sense to apply the same order to both Sarduri inscriptions: front, right, back, left. This does not solve every issue, but it reduces contradictions and matches how similar monuments were meant to be approached. Another interpretive problem lies in a separate inscription carved on the back wall of the right niche at the gate of the treasury, positioned behind where a stele and its base would have stood. This text includes the same standard accession formula that appears on the front face of the Serp Pogo stele, a statement that the god granted kingship and the king sat on his father's throne. That similarity pulls the niche text into the opening section of the Annals. Yet the passage that follows creates confusion. It lists military units in enormous numbers: 92 war chariots, several thousand cavalry, and more than 350,000 infantry. It continues with inventories of livestock, weapons of several types, grain, wine, oil, and bronze. What does this list represent? Two interpretations compete. It could be an inventory made at the moment of accession, a display of royal resources and military readiness. It could be a war booty record. Neither option fits perfectly. The infantry figure is far too large for a real army standing in formation. Yet the level of detail is unlike the annual booty totals usually placed at the end of a campaign year. Those year-end lists are normally formulaic and compact, whereas this text is unusually specific. Some terms hint at captured goods, but the passage does not name enemies or conquered lands, which would normally be expected if it described spoils taken in battle. Its position inside the niche also matters, because it stands behind the stele area. It may belong to the conclusion of the entire monument rather than the beginning. It reads like a final balance sheet. Titles reappear. Then, a broad accounting is presented, without being tied to any single expedition. Full clarity will likely depend on further advances in understanding the Urartian language. For now, the broader point remains. Previous reconstructions have not been fully satisfying, and alternative solutions have been proposed that aim for fewer internal conflicts. The best method begins by building a relative sequence first, using the fragments that clearly describe different wars. After that, synchronisms with Assyria offer the firm anchor points needed to turn relative order into absolute dates. Two moments of overlap with Assyrian history are especially valuable. They pin down the reign's opening phase and remove much of the guesswork. A workable synthesis of the surviving material can be described in a coherent narrative order. The Serp Pogo stele begins with the expected royal introduction. Titles, curses aimed at anyone who damages the monument, then the accession statement followed by the first campaign entry. Much of that first section is broken, leaving gaps that once carried key details. The right face of the same stele then preserves short but important notices. It names northern rulers and places in Transcaucasia, records victories, and even mentions an Assyrian king by name. It points to clashes involving a land called Arm and its royal centre, plus a northern campaign that seems to have started with a detailed account now lost in the break. The back face shifts west. It offers a fuller description of a campaign toward Malatya and includes the defeat of a ruler connected with that kingdom. A parallel text from the Euphrates region confirms the same event. The left face then describes a campaign against a land called Ryuisa and the punishment of its king. The end of that face is also missing, suggesting that additional victories once followed. At that point, the narrative appears to continue in the western niche. Inscription at the gate of the treasury. This passage reads like a single intense year. 3 different directions appear within the same annual frame. One campaign strikes across the Zagros, reaching the zone south of Lake Urmia and pushing against Mana, then moving toward regions named Babalu and Baruata. Another campaign drives north into Transcaucasia against Eteuni and Eriqua. A third campaign moves west and ends with the capture of a land called Urme, located beyond the Assyrian-controlled Subria region. The language used for timing suggests simultaneity. The sense is that several forces operated during the same year, not a single army marching on one road. The year ends with the familiar closing formula. After a break caused by damage to the main monument, further sections describe repeated northern operations, including an expedition toward Kulha. This land corresponds to the mountainous country, later known as Colchis, beyond the Kars and Sarikamish line, toward the Black Sea hinterland. The annals speak of capturing a local ruler and carrying him off as a prisoner. The same northern framework appears again soon after, as the record describes clashes with peoples and districts in Transcaucasia, whose locations can be traced through cross-references between inscriptions. The steady recurrence of these names supports a wider conclusion. Northern expeditions were not isolated episodes. They were a near-annual pattern of pressure, raid, and renewed control. The same text then introduces a detail with wide significance. During a later Kulha campaign, the record includes a statement about producing a seal of iron and erecting an inscription at a captured city. The wording matters because it preserves one of the very rare early references to iron in this tradition. The geographic context matters too. The Kulha region lies in the same broad arc that later Greek sources associate with early ironworking communities. Whether the annals intended to boast of technological prestige or simply to record an unusual object, the line links northern campaigning with access to metal resources and specialist production. The annals then swing to the east. A campaign against Puluadi culminates in the capture of a royal city called Libliuni. Sarduri claims that an inscription was set up there, and a surviving rock text in the same region repeats the episode clearly enough to confirm the location. The eastern push reaches farther than Urartu's armies had gone before. The pattern also changes. The record describes not only burning villages and deporting people, but also building fortresses. That detail suggests a planned conquest rather than a quick raid. Permanent structures imply an intention to stay, to hold mountain routes, to guard resources and to regulate movement. From there, the focus shifts again, back toward the west. Urartian forces cross the Euphrates and move out from their western bases to attack the kingdom of Commagene. The annals describe the capture of fortified royal cities, then present the submission of the local ruler, who kneels and offers tribute in silver, gold, textiles, bronze shields, and bronze vessels. The narrative portrays the result as a shift in status. A ruler who had previously given nothing to any king is now compelled to pay. The scene is staged in the standard imperial language of the time. Prayer to the gods, the opening of the road, victory granted by divine favour, then tribute measured out in precise amounts. At this point, Assyrian and Urartian timelines collide directly. Assyrian royal records, though damaged, describe an alliance of regional rulers, including Sarduri and several western kings, followed by an Assyrian victory. They mention Sarduri fleeing across an Euphrates bridge that marked the edge of his realm. They list rich spoils taken from the Urartian camp, including royal equipment and seals, along with vehicles and animals. Assyrian administrative year lists reduce the event to a blunt line. Urartu was defeated at Arpad. The convergence of these independent records locks the broader sequence into place. It also explains why certain Western rulers appear first as targets of Urartu, then later as tributaries of Assyria. Assyrian inscriptions add further detail. They describe Sarduri rising in opposition, combining with an ally, then being defeated between named districts. They claim seizure of the entire camp. They portray the king fleeing in panic to a steep mountain refuge. They continue by listing a chain of cities and lands brought under control in the aftermath, describing a sweeping march that encountered little resistance. A second Assyrian text presents the same arena of conflict from another angle, emphasizing that multiple Anatolian and North Syrian rulers were active in the struggle. In one account, a river is described as turning red, a typical rhetorical image meant to stamp the battle into memory. Against that background, the Urartian annals read differently. They are not a neutral chronicle. They are a state instrument shaped by a scribal system that probably operated across provinces. The close match between the central annals and far-flung rock inscriptions suggests an organized practice. A campaign report could be drafted, then sent to distant sites to be carved as an official monument. Later, the capital could gather those records and rework parts of them into the annual narrative format. No archive tablets survive from this period, yet the level of coordination makes written communication unavoidable. The material used for these drafts remains unknown. Clay tablets were not yet the standard in Urartu before the early 7th century. Less durable media such as wood or leather could have carried the texts, leaving no trace. Whatever the method, the administrative reality shows through the stone. A growing empire needed a reliable system to move information, fix decisions into text, and project authority across mountains and valleys. Meanwhile, the pattern of campaigning remains clear. 1 year can contain simultaneous operations in 3 directions. Northern raids recur repeatedly. Eastern expansion pushes into new terrain and shifts toward fortress building. Western expeditions aim to force tribute and to shape the politics of the late Hittite states, rather than permanently occupying everything beyond the Euphrates. The south and southeast remain tied to the Zagros and the regions around Lake Urmia, where Mana and neighbouring lands appear again and again as targets. Above all, the evidence shows a kingdom balancing ambition with geography. Mountains impose limits, distance strains logistics, and the empire responds by planting strong points, moving people, and writing its victories onto rock, hoping the stone will outlast the uncertainty of the frontier. The capture of Uluba in the eastern Habur region looks, at first glance, like a dramatic expansion of Assyrian power at Urartu's expense. In reality, it also carries a different meaning. It resembles the recovery of territory Assyria had once lost, decades earlier, back in the era when Urartu's kings had pushed south into areas that used to be under Assyrian control. Official Assyrian year records place an operation against Uluba in 739 BCE. Yet the monumental inscriptions complicate the picture. They often compress separate expeditions into a single sweeping narrative, combining episodes that may not belong to the same season, or even the same year. Because of that practice, the chronology can appear inconsistent unless the political setting is taken into account. Some researchers have treated the variations in the Assyrian royal texts as evidence for multiple campaigns against Urartu in different years, including another expedition later in the decade. Others argue for the opposite, pointing to repeated details that suggest a single major confrontation sits behind several versions of the story. One striking overlap is the list of allies mentioned in a key Assyrian victory account. The coalition resembles the one known from the clash at Arpad in 743 BCE. That similarity raises doubts about a later dating, because one of the alliance leaders had, not long after Arpad, lost political independence and was absorbed into the Assyrian provincial system. It becomes difficult to imagine the same figure leading a comparable coalition, again only a short time later. Another clue comes from the repeated reference to Sarduri's royal bed. Wherever this detail appears, it seems to belong to the same defeat narrative, not to separate events. When these hints are placed side by side, the simplest explanation is that several Assyrian texts, even if they differ in style and emphasis, are describing the same decisive encounter. Urartian records point in the same direction, though they do it in a different way. The annals linked to Sarduri reflect the opening phase of his western advance and stop at the moment of success, ending with the ruler of Commagene paying tribute. The later clash with Assyria and the defeat are absent. The silence is not an accident of preservation, it fits a broader pattern. Royal inscriptions rarely advertise failure. If the missing portion of the Urartian record had continued, it is highly unlikely that it suddenly would have presented the king's loss in detail. On the Assyrian side, the problem is reversed. Tiglath-Pileser's inscriptions inflate the outcome and wrap it in formulaic language that reads more like propaganda than a logistical report. The texts hint at a march deep into Urartu, even suggesting pressure on the capital itself. Yet they avoid the practical obstacles that such an advance would have faced. That absence matters. If an Assyrian army truly pushed far into Urartu, it would have had to deal with a chain of fortified places on the route, not least strong points on the road toward the Lake Van Basin. It would also have had to cross long distances late in the campaigning season. The gap between the Euphrates region and the Urartian heartland was not trivial. Even reaching the frontier could consume valuable time, leaving little room for a sustained pursuit, a siege, or a deep penetration into mountainous terrain before winter conditions closed the roads. The Assyrian texts do not describe these constraints, which is telling. In contrast, when the Assyrians narrate the capture of Aluba in 739 BCE, they provide a detailed list of place names, suggesting that operation was closer to Assyria's normal reach and easier to document with precision. The geographic clues around the main battle also anchor the story more firmly than the rhetorical claims. The place names Kistan and Halpi, associated with the battlefield, can be matched with locations in the Birichik area. A further anchor is a place described as being beside a lake, connected with the name Halpa. Modern historical geography has pointed to a lakeside setting around today's Gölbaşı, where an ancient mound also exists. Another topographic marker is the Sinzi River, described in connection with the fighting. This river aligns with the Göksu, a tributary system associated in later traditions with a river known as Singas. These anchors do not prove every detail in the royal narratives, but they keep the campaign grounded in a realistic corridor of movement. A further piece of information, known from a separate Assyrian text, sharpens the political mechanics behind the defeat. It suggests that the king of Commagene played a double role. He turned toward Assyria at the critical moment, then guided Assyrian forces toward the Urartian camp, making an attack easier. When this element is added, a coherent scenario emerges. In 743 BCE, Sarduri marches west from the Melitene base, crossing the Taurus through the same route that later generations would still use to connect the Malatya plain with the Gölbaşı basin. He seizes key settlements in Commagene, including a fortress near the lake. He pressures another stronghold where the local ruler seeks shelter. Tribute is paid, yet the submission is not stable. The same ruler reaches out to the Assyrian king, who at that moment is engaged in northern Syria. A sudden shift follows. Instead of becoming Urartu's dependent partner, Commagene becomes the trigger that exposes Sarduri's forces to a rapid counterstrike. This model has an advantage over older reconstructions that tried to split the events into two separate Western expeditions, one Urartian and one Assyrian, staged as if they were independent. It allows the Urartian annals to remain accurate in what they choose to show. The successful beginning of the campaign. It also explains why the Assyrian version focuses on the collapse and the spoils. Each side records what serves its purpose. Urartu emphasizes tribute and momentum. Assyria emphasizes panic, flight, and captured royal property. The same reconstruction depends on another chronological choice. The earlier clash between Sarduri and an Assyrian king named in the Urartian record must belong to the first year of that Assyrian ruler's reign, around 754 BCE. That year, Assyria is known to have campaigned to Arpad and concluded an agreement with the local ruler. The agreement itself hints at military pressure in the Middle Euphrates zone. A fragmentary passage even alludes to a land and to a Urartian figure, likely Sarduri, implying contact or confrontation. Not long after, the local ruler breaks the agreement and leans back toward Urartu, showing that loyalties in this frontier world were fluid and transactional. Even so, the timeline does not fit perfectly at every point. If Melitene was firmly under Urartu control, a victory over Assyria in the region becomes plausible. Yet other evidence suggests that Melitene was not secured until later. This leaves open the possibility that the early clash occurred on another front, not in the same corridor where later campaigns unfolded. The annals themselves, with their gaps and broken sections, make it difficult to distribute events year by year with full confidence. Still, if the year endings marked in the text are taken seriously, then the missing portion between the early conflict and the decisive Western War could cover roughly 11 years. That span matches the very period where the record becomes most fragmentary. Within that frame, a working set of dates can be assembled. Sarduri's accession falls around the mid-70s. The early clash with Assyria belongs to the first years after that. The Malatya campaign follows. A series of northern expeditions toward Kulha appear in the later 740s. An eastern push toward Puluwadi belongs to the mid-740s. The Commagene campaign and the defeat at the hands of Tiglath-Pileser fall in 743 BCE. A final northern expedition appears around 740 BCE. After that point, information about Sarduri becomes harder to pin down. What is clear is the strategic result of the defeat. Urartu's plan to cross the natural barrier of the Taurus and consolidate a lasting presence in Commagene collapses. The kingdom is forced back east of the Euphrates. The middle Euphrates base at Melitene can no longer be held. Assyrian texts begin to speak of the Euphrates as the boundary of Sarduri's realm, a phrase that makes sense only if Urartu has retreated from the western side and accepted a reduced frontier. In the years that follow, local rulers who once maneuvered between great powers are listed as Assyrian tributaries. Commagene's king, the ruler of Milidu, the lord of Gurgum, and other Anatolian leaders appear in Assyrian inscriptions as men who now pay to survive. With the coalition broken by force, Assyria regains control of an important zone of raw materials in the Taurus and its approaches. Even if anti-Assyrian sentiment never fully disappears, the region's political memory proves stubborn. Similar anti-Assyrian alignments reappear later in different forms. A generation after these events, a new Urartian king would seek partners again, this time including Carchemish and the Phrygian ruler remembered as Midas. Even Commagene and Urartu would align again at another moment. The pattern repeats because geography keeps producing the same pressure points. Mountain passes, metal districts, and the thin line where empires touch. In the 3 years that follow the Great Defeat, Urartu's attention shifts away from the west. Campaigns take place in Transcaucasia and in the lands of Mana. Fighting with Assyria moves toward the Iranian plateau and the Zagros. After about 740 BCE, Sarduri's reign fades into uncertainty. The annals do not continue cleanly. Later, rock inscriptions preserve names of places not mentioned in the surviving annalistic sections, suggesting that the last years of his rule were either recorded in missing fragments or never entered into the final compilation that has come down to the present. Yet Sarduri did not leave only war behind. Like other major Urartian kings, he also reshaped the landscape through construction. His most ambitious project was a new stronghold built roughly 20 kilometers southeast of the capital. Following dynastic custom, he gave it a name built from his own: Sarduri's city. The site is known today as Çavuştepe. It stands on a long ridge above the Hoshap Valley, echoing the dramatic setting of the capital's rock. Here, the signature features of Urartian fortress design can be seen clearly. A large area carved and levelled, thick defensive walls, rock-cut cisterns, storage facilities for provisions, and a canal below that served irrigation and supply. Excavations at both the upper and lower fortress zones revealed temple buildings preserved in striking condition. In the main fortress area stood a square tower temple dedicated to a local deity. Its facade, built from carefully polished basalt blocks set with almost mechanical precision, displays Urartian stone craftsmanship at its highest level. The inscription carved onto the gleaming stone is not merely an announcement of power. It is also a deliberate visual statement, shaped as much by aesthetic control as by political messaging. With Sarduri's generation, the narrative begins to shift toward the era of Rusa. The long, grinding conflict with Assyria no longer plays out mainly on the western frontier. The centre of gravity moves east into the Zagros and the Iranian Highlands. That change coincides with the rise of a powerful Assyrian ruler who pushes aggressive campaigns into the same regions. From this point onward, the record becomes richer in some ways, because Assyrian sources multiply. Annals, monumental inscriptions, and intelligence reports describe the fighting with vivid detail, especially from Assyria's perspective. The battleground is the northwestern Iranian plateau, where the people of Mana are concentrated and where local rulers attempt to survive between two empires. Assyrian narratives describe internal crises among the Manian rulers, then show Urartu stepping in to exploit the divisions. Two factions form, one leaning toward Urartu, the other toward Assyria. A pro-Assyrian king is attacked and killed. The Assyrian response is brutal, designed to terrify and deter. Leaders are captured and executed publicly. A replacement ruler takes the throne, but his orientation soon forces another Assyrian intervention. Cities are burned, strongpoints are seized, and the new king submits through tribute in order to survive. Even so, Urartu's influence does not vanish. Some rulers remain loyal to Urartu and later fight alongside it during major confrontations. Assyria's war record for this period is unusually detailed. One major campaign is preserved not only in royal annals, but also in a lengthy clay tablet narrative that reads like an official report. Alongside this, a set of letters from the Assyrian court, especially intelligence correspondence, provides a rare view into how the conflict was monitored. Scouts and border watchers track Urartian troop movements, report political fractures at the Urartian court, and describe events that royal inscriptions tend to obscure. Some messages come from local rulers who occupy fragile positions between the two powers, including the king of Mushashir, a small kingdom that tries to preserve autonomy while surrounded by larger forces. From this archive emerges a complicated picture of the years leading up to 714 BCE, the date that can be fixed with certainty. That year, an Assyrian campaign becomes the turning point. Its outcome is clear. The Assyrians claim to have ended the war by crushing resistance in the Iranian theatre. The consequences are also clear. A major Urartian defeat follows, the ruler of Mushashir is removed, and the great temple of the chief Urartian god at Mushashir is looted. Sacred treasures and divine images are carried away to Assyria. Whether every detail of the official version is true is another question, but the political shock is undeniable. The hardest problem is arranging the events that lead into that climax. A bilingual inscription issued by Rusa, now partially recovered, describes a dramatic episode centered on Mushashir. It presents a long-standing dynastic relationship with the temple there. It claims that the local king tried to bar Rusa from ritual access, then fled to Assyria. It narrates a punitive expedition, a battle in the mountains, the capture of the local king, and his reinstatement on the throne as a subordinate. It then describes days of ritual offerings and feasting, ending with the king's standard self-praise and claims of divine support. This account aligns with letters sent by the Mushashir ruler to the Assyrian king. In one message, he insists that rituals in the temple can be performed only with his permission, warning of Urartu's approach. He reports that Urartu has even sent officials ahead. In another phase of correspondence, he appears as an Assyrian dependent summoned to the Assyrian court. Such shifts reveal the survival logic of small states, caught between empires. Promises are made. Oaths are sworn. Alliances shift. A ruler tries to preserve autonomy by leaning one way, then the other, until pressure becomes impossible to manage. At the same time, another danger appears on the horizon: the arrival of the Cimmerians. Several Assyrian letters describe these raids and the chaos they cause. Reports claim that Urartian forces suffered a severe defeat against them. Urartian officials were killed. A high commander was taken alive. The messages do not always match in numbers, which is normal for battlefield reports, yet they agree on the central fact: the shock was real. The correspondence also offers an important detail about movement routes. A report describes the Cimmerians withdrawing, then entering Urartu from the direction of Mana. That statement implies an approach through the Armenian Highlands rather than a direct descent from the Caucasus. Later traditions remembered a different route, which creates a historical problem. But at minimum, the Assyrian messages show where the invaders were observed in that specific moment. Assyrian intelligence did more than report battles. It also monitored political stability inside Urartu. Letters speak of violent internal conflict, then sudden calm. They mention the capture of a key commander. They report that the Urartian king is located in a place called Uazaun. The same letters note diplomatic activity. The ruler of Mushashir visits the Urartian court, joined by relatives. Another envoy appears from a neighbouring region. Meanwhile, border garrisons send consistent updates. Everything suggests a region on edge, where raids, court intrigue, and shifting alliances are unfolding at the same time. One letter even provides a rough dating clue by referencing the household of an Assyrian princess, married into an Anatolian dynasty. That detail implies a period when relations between Assyria and certain Western partners were still stable, before later campaigns destroyed that arrangement. Taken together, these scattered pieces do not form a perfectly ordered, year-by-year chronology. They do something else. They give a ground-level view of an imperial frontier where power is not a clean line on a map, but a constant process of negotiation, coercion, intelligence gathering, and sudden violence. One more letter attributed to Sennacherib survives only in a damaged form, yet it still adds an important detail. It quotes the ruler of Mushashir, Urzana, and reports that the governor of Wesi has been killed. letters of this type, along with others in the same group, share a revealing pattern. With one exception that notes a Cimmerian group withdrawing from Mana and entering Urartu. Nearly all of them describe an Urartian campaign directed against a place called Gamira. The final message in that set goes further. After news spreads that the expedition against Gamira ended in defeat, it also notes that fear of Assyria suddenly rises inside Urartu. Immediately after that remark, the text breaks, but it seems to mention a messenger connected to the king of Mana. That hint matters, because it places Gamira close to Mana territory and supports dating these events to 715 BCE or to the spring months of 714 BCE. In the Assyrian royal record, Urartu's king is active in the Mana region during this same period. The name Gamira in these reports does not have to mean a fixed country with hard borders. It can just as easily reflect a mobile people, or the area where the Cimmerians happened to be concentrated at the time. If that final letter is placed correctly in time, it captures a moment of pressure stacking on top of pressure. Urartu is portrayed as expecting an Assyrian strike right after confronting the Cimmerians. Because the Cimmerians were mobile raiders rather than a state with an administration, the clash did not produce lasting territorial changes inside Urartu's empire. The consequences were different. The battle inflicted heavy losses and the shock travelled straight into the political centre. After the defeat, a deeper crisis unfolds, one that threatens the royal house itself. The army appears to have retreated in disorder. Reports speak of governors and senior commanders being killed or captured. Rumours spread because the fate of King Rusa is suddenly unclear. In that atmosphere, the soldiers are said to have proclaimed a prince named Melatua as king, right there in the camp. This figure does not appear in Urartian inscriptions. He is known only through Assyrian reporting, which makes the episode feel like a snapshot of panic rather than a settled constitutional change. At the same time, unrest breaks out in the capital. A coup attempt takes place in Tushpa. The timing is not easy to fix, but the meaning is clear. The king's position has become fragile. An Assyrian intelligence letter describes arrests inside the inner circle. A group of eunuchs close to the monarch is detained as conspirators. Interrogations follow. Another group, both eunuchs and bearded officials, is dragged in as associates. Soldiers are executed. A high-ranking officer connected to a man named Abliuknu is arrested along with Abliuknu's brother. Abliuknu then comes to the capital. The king questions both men, then releases them after deciding they are not involved. The language of the report is clinical, yet it reflects a court in crisis, trying to isolate betrayal while the state is still reeling from military disaster. The dating of that letter remains disputed, as so often happens with this archive. Another document identifies Abliuknu as the Urartian governor stationed opposite Mushashir. Elsewhere, an Assyrian report claims that the governor in that same position was among the officials killed during the Cimmerian disaster. That overlap sounds decisive, but it may not be. The dead governor could have been Abliuknu's predecessor, meaning the evidence does not lock the chronology in place. Still, another fragmentary letter links Abliuknu with Melatua and describes troops being gathered in a district called Uazaun. The message states that forces are assembling there, yet the target of the planned strike is not specified. If these preparations belong to the Gamira operation, then a plausible chain can be built. Planning and troop concentration. A campaign against the Cimmerians, a collapse with heavy losses, uncertainty about the king's fate, talk of a replacement, and then political violence at the capital. It is only one reconstruction, but it explains why so many alarming events cluster in the same narrow window. This intelligence correspondence is rich, yet it rarely allows precise dating. The letters are often fragmentary, and their topics do not always connect neatly. They can create the illusion of constant chaos simply because more documents survive for this period. The end of Rusa's reign looks especially turbulent, not necessarily because it was uniquely unstable, but because Assyrian reporting is unusually dense and unusually close to the action. New interpretations will likely keep shifting particular events forward or back by a season or a year. What does not change is the larger pattern. Once Urartu shows signs of weakness, Sargon recognizes an opening. The Assyrian king sees a chance to strike the rival power hard enough to remove it as a strategic threat. Letters from Nineveh describe Urartian movements and alert status in the run-up to Sargon's famous 8th campaign. That operation, carried out in Sargon's 8th regnal year, is recorded in the most detailed narrative Assyria ever produced, for a single expedition. A long account preserved on clay tablets describes the marching routes and the sequence of targets in the form of an elevated report addressed to the god Ashur. According to this narrative, the Assyrian army leaves its bases at the beginning of summer. The force includes infantry units of different types, cavalry, chariot contingents, raiding scouts, specialized troops, and long supply trains carried by pack animals. Siege engines do not appear as a major feature, which suggests that the planners expected difficult terrain and quick strikes rather than prolonged sieges. The army moves east, crosses the greater and lesser Zab rivers, then cuts through the Zagros ranges into the uplands. The primary targets are the Manian districts of Andia and Zikirtu, areas where resistance and rebellion had become chronic. Mana's ruler, Ulusunu, abandons his capital and submits, presenting loyalty and tribute to the Assyrian king. From there, Sargon pushes southeast toward Pasua, receiving tribute from local chiefs in the Armenian Highlands, then turns north again. After ravaging Zikirtu, the Assyrian force enters a Manian district described as being under Rusa's control. A major confrontation follows at Mount Uaus. Rusa and his ally Metati are defeated in the campaign's single, decisive field battle. The narrative claims that elite Urartian troops and possibly members of the royal household are taken. Rusa escapes on horseback. With that victory, Andia and Zikirtu are treated as subdued, and the army presses toward Urartu itself. The Assyrian account then mentions a strong frontier fortress called Ushkaya, described as a major stronghold with walls of impressive thickness. The description matches what archaeology has revealed about typical Urartian fortresses: massive stone defences built to dominate routes through the mountains. Yet the exact placement of several districts named in the narrative remains uncertain even today, including how far east the Manaean world extended and where the borderlands merged into Urartian-controlled terrain. The next stages of the campaign are still debated. Older reconstructions imagine Sargon tracing a huge circle around the Great Lakes of the region. More recent geographic reassessments have narrowed the likely path, arguing that the army reached only certain corridors, rather than completing a full loop. The central disagreement is whether the route wrapped around the entire lake basin or stayed largely on the western side. As the narrative continues, a series of districts and strongholds appear, but two episodes receive special emphasis. First comes the destruction of a city called Ulhu. The text portrays it as one of Rusa's finest residences, praised for its orchards and irrigation works. The description lingers on water management. Canals, diverted streams, fields turned green, gardens kept alive through engineered flow. It reads like an inverted foundation inscription, admiring the achievements only to underline the pleasure of smashing them. The conqueror is shown entering the palace, tearing down walls, uprooting trees, breaking storehouses, opening granaries, and consuming the accumulated provisions. The point is not heroism on a battlefield. The point is humiliation through the ruin of prosperity. The final section of the story widens again. Rusa had focused on the eastern frontier out of necessity, facing instability and threats in the highlands. Yet, he had not ignored the west. A broader alliance network was forming across the small states of northern Syria and Anatolia, many of them trying to survive by switching sides and delaying full subjugation. To the west, a powerful Phrygian kingdom had emerged under its famous ruler Mita, remembered later as Midas, controlling a wide zone of routes and resources. It is likely that contacts existed between Urartu and this power, whether directly or through intermediary states. How deep those ties went remains uncertain. The same is true for the timing. The motives, however, are easy to understand. Nomadic raids threatened the north and east. Assyria threatened the south and west. Trade corridors and access to metal districts depended on small kingdoms that could block or open roads. Assyrian sources frame these networks as conspiracies and betrayal, because that language justifies punishment. In this style of writing, a campaign is always presented as moral correction and rightful enforcement. Sargon's operations against places like Carchemish and Tabal are explained through the same logic. Rulers are accused of disloyalty, secret contacts, and invitations to enemies. Whether those accusations describe a real coordinated plan or simply provide a pretext for annexation remains hard to decide, case by case. The difficulty increases because one major fact presses on every reconstruction. If Rusa truly died in direct response to the Mushashir disaster in 714 BCE, then any large Western alliance built in his name must have occurred before that year. If the alliance activity appears to belong later, then either the Assyrian scribes used Rusa's name loosely, or the political sequence is more complex than the official narrative admits. A different possibility is that some of the diplomacy attributed to Rusa actually belongs to his successor, Argishti, and that later writers simply attached it to the more famous figure out of habit. If the story of Rusa's collapse after the defeat against Sargon in 714 BCE is correct, then the succession must have happened fast. In that same year, his son Argishti II appears to take the throne. Yet the problem begins immediately. The reign of this king is not illuminated primarily by Urartian records. It is seen mostly through Assyrian eyes, in royal inscriptions and intelligence letters. Even then, the placement of each report in a secure timeline remains difficult. The messages do not always reveal whether they describe a sequence of events in real time, or whether they have been gathered and presented out of order. As a result, the order in which episodes are usually listed may not match the order in which they actually happened. One of the clearest starting points comes from a monumental Assyrian text of Sargon. In that inscription, the king describes a ruler of Commagene named Mutalu in sharply hostile language. The passage claims that Mutalu stopped paying dues and withheld the expected gifts because he trusted in a Urartian supporter, Argishti. The wording is propaganda, designed to frame Assyria's enemies as insolent and faithless, but it also reveals a strategic reality. Urartu was still trying to build a western front. The political setting fits the years when Sargon was occupied in Babylonia, around 709 BCE, because this is exactly the kind of moment when border kingdoms tested Assyria's reach. The pattern is familiar from earlier generations as well. Decades before, a similar clash had unfolded in the same region, with Urartu and Assyria colliding over Commagene and the Middle Euphrates corridor. Now, the cycle seems to return, only with new names and a new Assyrian king. In the end, Assyria moves in, absorbs Commagene, and even relocates populations into the region under imperial control. Along the northern edge of Mesopotamia, the small country of Subria sits in a tense frontier zone. From the time of Minua through the later kings, this borderland repeatedly becomes a target for Urartian pressure. An Assyrian letter from Nineveh reports that the Urartian king, whether Rusa I or Argishti II, was leaning heavily on Subria's ruler. Another intelligence report goes further and describes the condition of Urartu's defences under Argishti. Garrisons are said to be ready for action across the entire line of forts, from the border all the way to the capital at Tushba. That picture suggests a state trying to recover after disaster, tightening its grip on the frontier, reorganising its forces and preparing for renewed threats. Any military activity during Argishti's reign must be read in that light, as a response to losses suffered against the Cimmerians and against Assyria. Within this context, one structure becomes especially significant. East of Erzincan, a heavily fortified stronghold known today as Aluntepe stands on a hill, about 20 kilometers from the city. Its ancient name is not preserved, yet the site is unmistakable in character. A major Urartian centre with remarkably well-preserved architecture, including a tower temple, a stone-built storage system, a cult zone marked by stelae, and, unusually, traces of wall paintings. Ivory objects and bronze works from the site belong among the finest known examples of Urartian craftsmanship. Inscriptions on bronze pieces found in elite burials support placing the site in the era of Argishti II. The location matters as much as the finds. It represents the westernmost known Urartian fortress, a statement of reach, ambition, and anxiety at the same time. A rare Assyrian letter from Kalhu, preserved almost complete, offers a sharper glimpse of the diplomatic landscape. Dated to 710 or 709 BCE, it is written as a reply from Sargon to his governor in Cilicia, and it summarizes earlier messages in a way that makes the exchange feel like a real dialogue. The central issue is Assyria's relationship with Phrygia. A local king in Cilicia, Urik, has apparently sent envoys toward Urartu. A delegation of 14 men is intercepted by Phrygia's ruler, Meta, known in later Greek tradition as Midas, and handed over to the Assyrian governor. For Sargon, this is a prize. Only a short time earlier, Phrygia could appear in Assyrian texts as a dangerous rival. Now, the tone shifts. The Assyrian court treats Meta not as an immediate enemy, but as a useful partner. The same letter also touches on smaller states, local disputes, and requests made by minor rulers, showing a landscape filled with fragile alliances and constant negotiation. A new political alignment is forming, and older coalitions begin to lose their weight. This change hits Urartu directly. Meta's shift weakens Urartu's Western influence. Earlier, kings had consistently pursued policies aimed at resisting Assyria, and Argishti II seems to have tried the same approach. The maneuvers of Commagene's king and the initiatives of the Cilician ruler echo older attempts to gather an anti-Assyrian front. At the same time, cultural signs suggest contact zones and overlapping traditions in the far west. The use of hieroglyphic writing in administrative contexts at Aluntepe, far from the Urartian heartland, makes more sense in a world where Urartu is trying to operate in regions shaped by Anatolian scribal culture. Even if specific names cannot be proven on individual objects, the broader conclusion remains. This Western outpost absorbed influences from a different writing tradition and a different political neighbourhood. Establishing such a distant centre looks less like a random building project and more like part of a calculated strategy. If the dating around 710 and 709 BCE is correct, that strategy may have been pursued from the earliest years after Argishti came to power. Yet the window closes quickly. Sargon's letter implies that by 709 BCE at the latest, Phrygia has chosen to accommodate the stronger imperial power. The smaller states of Cappadocia and Cilicia, and any partners they might have drawn in, do not change the outcome. Urartu II is effectively abandoned. This means the policy Argishti may have hoped to pursue, gaining strength in the west to offset losses in the southeast, does not work. Once it fails, a choice remains. Expansion and consolidation must shift toward the southeast again. Even though the terrain there is harder, the political situation has changed, and the old zones of influence around the Zagros and the southern reaches of Lake Urmia are no longer easy to recover. Mana, once a crucial arena for Urartu's influence, has moved beyond reach. Military and political energy turns toward new directions. Evidence for that redirection appears in the highlands to the northeast. A stele of Argishti II was found near a mountain pass about 2,700 meters high, not far from the Sicyan region. The inscription suggests control of a route running between the Nakhchivan area and the region around modern Khan Kendi, opening access into what is now known as Karabakh. The text speaks of the capture of a land called Suluk and a city named Irdua, and it describes the army reaching a place called Amusa, a name that may preserve an older toponym for a strategically important settlement. Farther east, inscriptions near the slopes of Mount Sabalan describe new conquest up to a river boundary, mention additional lands brought under control, and record the foundation of a city bearing the king's own name. These sites lie far to the east, closer to the Caspian world than earlier Urartian horizons. Yet the Urartians do not appear obsessed with reaching the sea. Their focus remains on corridors, passes, and defensible landscapes. In a sense, an older pattern repeats, but shifted east. In the time of Minua, two rival empires could expand without constant direct clashes, as long as they avoided pressing into the same corridor at the same moment. In the 7th century, something similar seems to happen again. Instead of natural boundaries alone, the frontiers are increasingly shaped by the outcome of wars, and by the creation of separated spheres of influence. These lines limit direct battles, but they do not reduce pressure. They simply relocate it. The surviving Urartian texts from the reign of Argishti II are few, but they create a consistent impression. A king deeply engaged in construction, planning, and the building of durable infrastructure. The program is continued and expanded under his son, Rusa II. Inscriptions from the north shore of Lake Van near Erchish refer to building activity and reveal the existence of another city bearing the name Argistihinali, distinct from the earlier foundation in the Aras Valley. Like earlier rulers, who described themselves as bringers of water and fertility, Argishti presents the transformation of barren land into productive countryside as a royal achievement. In one text, he speaks of a place that once had no fields, no vineyards, no orchards, and no canal. Then, a reservoir or water system is created, and the landscape is reshaped. The reverse side of the same monument includes rules about sacrifice connected to irrigation work, showing how agriculture, ritual, and royal authority are fused into a single narrative. When Rusa II comes to power, the nature of Urartian documentation changes in a noticeable way. Instead of campaigns and battle reports, there is a flood of building inscriptions and dedication texts. A new administrative habit emerges as well. Clay tablets, sealed and written in cuneiform, appear as official carriers of information. This is a major shift because such documents do not exist from earlier reigns in the same form. Another innovation appears in the visual language of power. Low relief decoration becomes characteristic in certain cities linked to this period. Architectural patterns also evolve, and the scale of construction resembles the massive building phase once associated with Minua. Archaeology has identified several fortified centres, built or reworked under Rusa II, including major strongholds that have transformed modern understanding of Urartian culture. The emerging picture is a deliberate network of fortified residences, arranged like a chain, intended to strengthen defence and to tighten economic control over provinces. Rusa II is a contemporary of Assyrian kings such as Sennacherib and Esarhaddon. Sennacherib's evidence does not anchor Urartian chronology securely, but Esarhaddon provides a sharper point of contact. His texts connect Rusa with a campaign against Subria around 673 or 672 BCE. In that context, Esarhaddon claims to have sent Urartian refugees back to their own king after taking Subria, framing the act as a matter of honouring agreements. The language emphasises investigation and verification. Then, the return of people who had fled. It suggests that relations between Assyria and Urartu, at least at certain moments, were regulated through formal understandings, rather than open war. A separate tradition, preserved in biblical narrative, also points toward the same broader political world. After Sennacherib is murdered by his sons, the assassins are said to flee toward the mountains identified with Ararat. Behind that brief line lies the struggle over the Assyrian throne between a senior heir and the younger son later chosen as successor. Such turmoil helps explain why cross-border asylum and the demand to return fugitives could become a pressing diplomatic issue. Esarhaddon speaks as if a binding agreement exists, and his actions imply that accepting political refugees was a sensitive act with consequences. If Assyria returned fugitives to Urartu, it is likely that Urartu, under that same logic, avoided receiving Assyrian fugitives in return. Subria, by contrast, is portrayed as a place where fugitives could gather, including criminals but also officers and officials, precisely the kind of people linked to court conspiracies. The exact year when Rusa II began to rule is not known, but the scale and breadth of his building activity strongly suggest a long reign. What can be said with confidence is that he is on Urartu's throne by 680 BCE and stands as Esarhaddon's counterpart in the diplomatic framework mentioned in Assyrian sources. Soon after taking power, the first major problem area appears to be north of the Aras. In the region near modern Yerevan, the older provincial centre at Erebuni is abandoned as the main hub, and a new fortified city is founded on the bank of the Razdan River, at a site known today as Khamir Blur. In inscriptions it is presented as a newly built royal foundation, and it is tied directly to the king's accession. Bronze shields found there carry texts that show state property and military resources being moved into the new centre. Even when older dedication inscriptions bear the name of an earlier king, their presence in the new city implies an official transfer of treasure and equipment from the former administrative hub. The reasons are not spelled out, but the logic is plausible. The new site has a stronger topographic position for control and supply, and it likely served economic and administrative efficiency as well as defence. The building texts emphasise that the city is founded together with a major temple for the state god Haldi, and the language explicitly links the construction to the moment when Haldi grants royal authority and the king takes his father's place. Shortly after, another major foundation appears far to the southeast at Bastam in the Khoi region. The inscription describes a place previously considered unproductive, now transformed through royal initiative. The complex carries a name that translates as a small city of Rusa, and it includes a cult centre established for Haldi. A further document adds a chronological clue by dating a foundation year relative to another royal building across from a mountain, linking Bastam with the construction sequence that also includes the royal residence later known at Toprakale near Van. Taken together, these foundations show what Rusa II is attempting in the early years. A reorganisation of the state through a network of new strongholds, spanning from distant provinces toward the core. Fortified centres are placed around Lake Van itself as part of a defensive ring, including sites on high, naturally protected positions. Such choices suggest a change in the political climate. The burden of organising this network implies not a temporary alarm, but a persistent danger. The threat does not seem to be the familiar one from Assyria alone. It points to a new pressure rising from elsewhere, even if the sources never say it plainly. Assyrian texts hint at the nature of that danger through their own questions and fears. In a prayer text connected to Esarhaddon, a divination inquiry asks whether Rusa will march with his army, whether attacks will come for plunder and raiding, and whether Subria and its fortresses will be approached. The same body of divination texts repeatedly mentions Cimmerians and Scythians as active dangers, often in connection with the Mana region. In another report, settled populations such as Urartu and Mana are listed alongside mobile groups, such as Scythians and Cimmerians, treating them all as potential attackers. An Assyrian messenger is forced to flee toward Hubushkia after being assaulted, and the possible attackers include Cimmerians, Urartians, Manians, or Scythians. Esarhaddon's annals also mention fighting the Cimmerians in the Hubushkia region, while other texts describe Scythians, concentrating near the same mountain passes. The picture that emerges is not a single enemy, but a destabilized zone where states and mobile confederations intersect, and where frontier corridors can change hands quickly. This is the landscape that begins to reshape the balance of power. The mountainous region corresponding broadly to Iranian Kurdistan becomes a gateway through which new Iranian-speaking groups enter. Groups that will eventually contribute to the collapse of both Urartu and Assyria. In the meantime, the older buffer zone between the two empires is no longer secure. It is increasingly occupied by these new forces. Urartu's intense defensive building and the apparent shift away from large-scale expansion fit a world where holding ground becomes more important than gaining it. Despite the scarcity of Urartian narrative texts for this period, one fragmentary inscription from the Lake Van area hints that Rusa II was not completely inactive in the west. The damaged text speaks of deportations of men and women from regions named Muski, Hani, and Haletu. The names are hard to align with certainty, but the direction suggests Anatolian and Syrian borderlands. Phrygia, late Neo-Hittite areas, and perhaps a population later remembered in Greek tradition under a different label. Even in fragmentary form, the text shows that the Urartian state still had reach, still had targets, and still relied on the traditional imperial tool of forced resettlement. Yet the overall trajectory points toward a changed era, one defined less by confident conquest and more by strategic reorganization under growing, unfamiliar pressure. Beyond the founding of new cities, the reign of Rusa II was marked by a series of ambitious projects and monumental works that reshaped the landscape of the Urartian kingdom. One of the most striking examples stands west of Van, near a mountain lake known today as Kish Gulu. A stone stele discovered on its shore describes the creation of an artificial reservoir connected by canals to the newly founded royal city of Rusahinili. The lake itself was not a natural feature but a carefully engineered construction, designed to support both agriculture and settlement. In the inscription, the king presents this achievement as part of the same vision that led to the establishment of Rusahinhili, linking urban foundation, hydraulic engineering, and royal authority into a single narrative of transformation. The text speaks of land reshaped and reclaimed. Areas once described as barren are now filled with vineyards, grain fields, forests, and cultivated soil. References move between distant places and the royal centre at Tushpa, presenting these projects as part of a unified system rather than isolated works. The tone is one of accomplishment and permanence, emphasizing scale and endurance. Even today, the artificial lake and its associated canals continue to irrigate the Van Plain, much like the Great Canal projects attributed to earlier Urartian rulers. The continuity of use underscores the technical sophistication behind these constructions and the long-term vision that guided them. A similar transformation unfolded in the Aras Plain. Another monumental inscription, found near modern Ejmiatsin, describes large-scale agricultural development in lands that had previously been unproductive. Fields, orchards, vineyards, and new settlements are said to have been established, supported by a canal drawn from the river, known today as the Razdan. The narrative again concludes with references to ritual offerings, linking successful cultivation to divine favour. In these accounts, irrigation, agriculture, and religion appear inseparable, forming a single framework through which royal power was expressed and legitimized. Other surviving documents suggest that religious practice assumed a more prominent role during this period than in earlier generations. This shift may reflect a growing sense of uncertainty as external pressures mounted and the political environment became less stable. At the same time, Urartian material culture reached an extraordinary level of refinement. The final phase of Urartian history produced not only monumental fortresses and imposing architecture, but also some of the finest examples of craftsmanship ever created within the kingdom. Stone carving, metalwork, and decorative arts all show a level of development unseen in earlier periods. Reliefs from sites such as Adil Chevaz and Kef Kalesi, inlaid works and bronze figurines from Toprak, and elaborately decorated shields stand as evidence of this artistic peak. These objects reveal a culture investing heavily in symbolic display at a moment when political realities were becoming increasingly fragile. The exact duration of Rusa II's reign remains unknown. Neither its beginning nor its end can be firmly fixed. One of the key questions concerns the fate of the fortress at Bastam. Some scholars have argued that the site was destroyed during Rusa's lifetime, sometime between 660 and 650. This interpretation is based on a destruction layer containing the remains of roughly 1,200 slaughtered animals and a similar number of sealed clay bullae stamped with the royal seal. If the city had been founded around 675, this would imply a lifespan of only 2 decades. Yet the massive scale of the fortifications and the presence of multiple architectural phases suggest a much longer period of occupation. A short existence appears unlikely for a site of such complexity and investment. The bullae found at Bastam have also been used to argue for the presence of royal family members, holding administrative authority at the site. The seals often carry a specific title, indicating elite status, and the individuals named have been interpreted as contemporaries, or relatives of Rusa II. However, this interpretation remains uncertain. Some tablets, from Bastam and Khamir Blur, bear seals naming figures who appear to be sons of a ruler named Sarduri, pointing instead to a later generation. It is entirely possible that Rusa's royal seal continued to be used for official purposes even after his death, a practice known from other ancient states. The archaeological context of the bullae does not, by itself, provide a secure basis for early dating. The chronological framework of the 7th century remains deeply problematic. Only one date connected to Rusa II can be considered secure, the reference to events around 600, 73, or 672. The name Rusa appears again in Assyrian records from the early 600s and 50s. But it is unclear whether this refers to the same individual or to a later king bearing the same name. A particularly important episode occurs in 600 to 53, following a major battle near the Ulai River. After his victory over Elam, the Assyrian king Assurbanipal stages a triumphal celebration at Arbela. Reliefs from the palace at Nineveh show him standing in his chariot, receiving envoys from many lands. Among them are representatives of Urartu. The accompanying inscription states that the Urartian king, named Rusa, submitted out of fear and sent his nobles to inquire after the Assyrian king's well-being. The prominence given to the Urartian envoys in this scene suggests that Urartu was still regarded as a significant political entity at the time. The king's decision to send representatives indicates close attention to international developments and a pragmatic approach to diplomacy. Not long before this event, fighting had also taken place in the Subria region. An official described as the governor of Urartu attacked neighbouring cities but was killed by pro-Assyrian forces, and his severed head was sent to Nineveh. This episode confirms that the struggle over the Upper Tigris region continued until very late in the history of both states. Subria remained a contested frontier zone, fought over repeatedly by Urartu and Assyria. The final appearance of a Urartian king in Assyrian sources occurs around 643 or 642. In this account, Assurbanipal describes receiving homage from a king named Sarduri, who sends gifts and expresses loyalty in language normally reserved for submissive rulers. This is the last securely dated reference to a Urartian king. After this moment, the historical record falls silent. Who followed Rusa II on the throne and how long the kingdom survived afterward remain open questions. The surviving evidence is sparse and fragmentary. Several royal names appear, including multiple individuals named Rusa and Sarduri, but their precise order and relationships are unclear. In one case, a king named Rusa is identified as the son of a man named Erimena, a name otherwise unknown in royal contexts. This suggests a possible break in dynastic continuity. Other inscriptions and objects refer to figures who carry elite titles, but not explicit or royal designations, making it difficult to determine whether they were kings, heirs, or high-ranking administrators. Clay tablets and seal impressions from sites such as Bastam and Khamir Blur preserve the names of several individuals connected to the ruling house. Some are identified as sons of Sarduri, others as sons of Rusa. The repeated appearance of a title associated with royal offspring adds further complexity. It remains unclear whether this designation refers specifically to heirs, to sons of the queen, or more generally to members of the royal family entrusted with administrative authority. The reforms introduced under Rusa II may have expanded the use of such titles beyond their earlier meaning. As a result, multiple reconstructions of the final Urartian dynasty have been proposed. All remain hypothetical. What can be said with confidence is that Urartu still existed as a political entity around 643, when envoys were sent to Assyria. This marks the last firm date in Urartian history. The circumstances of the kingdom's final collapse are unknown. Estimates range from the mid-640s to the early 620s. Some scholars attribute the end of Urartu to pressure from Scythian groups, others to broader regional instability. In contrast, the fall of Assyria is documented in greater detail. Babylonian and Median forces captured Assur in 614, Nineveh in 612, and Haran in 610. Contemporary historians have described this sudden collapse of a powerful empire as a historical shock. A similar sense of mystery surrounds the disappearance of Urartu, especially given the extensive defensive works constructed only decades earlier. Even after its political structures ceased to function, the name Urartu did not vanish immediately. In slightly altered form, it continued to appear in Babylonian and Persian sources, sometimes referring to a region rather than a state. Babylonian chronicles describe campaigns into mountainous areas identified as Urartu during the years following the fall of Assyria. These accounts mention the burning of settlements and repeated incursions into the highlands north of Mesopotamia. Later, Persian sources provide further glimpses. In the great trilingual inscription of Darius, the region is described as the site of revolts and military campaigns. Commanders are sent against the land known as Urartu, or Armenia, and a series of battles is recorded across the region. These accounts reveal a landscape still organized around fortified centers and cities, much as it had been under Urartian rule. Infrastructure such as major canals continued to function, indicating a degree of administrative continuity even after dynastic power had ended. Personal names from this period suggest cultural survival as well. Some individuals involved in rebellions or military campaigns bear names derived from the Urartian god Haldi, indicating that elements of Urartian religious identity persisted into the 6th century. Yet none of these figures claim descent from the old royal house. The memory of the Urartian kings appears to have faded, even as aspects of their political and cultural legacy were absorbed into new imperial systems. With the incorporation of the region into the Persian Empire, Urartu became a satrapy known as Armenia. Certain traditions, especially those connected to royal display and military equipment, show clear continuity from Urartian models. The final assertion of Persian authority in the Van region occurred under Xerxes, who commemorated himself and his father with inscriptions carved into the rock.